Silas Crowe didn't knock. He never did. He pushed through the door of the Maston County Sheriff's office like he owned the building, the town, and everything breathing inside it, because for the better part of a decade, he more or less did. 3 of his men followed him in without being invited. The 4th stayed outside with his hand resting on his rifle, watching the street like he was waiting for someone stupid enough to make a scene. Sheriff Dale Pruitt looked up from his desk. He was 61 years old, had a bad knee that never healed right, and owed 2 months of back wages to his only deputy. He looked at Silas Crowe the way a man looks at weather he can't outrun. "Got a name for you," Crowe said. He dropped a folded paper on the desk without ceremony. "Cattle thief operating out of the East Valley. Man named Caleb Voss." The sheriff didn't touch the paper. "Voss? That quiet rancher up by the creek bend?" "Quiet's one word for it," Crowe smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I'd use dishonest. If you've ever watched a man decide in real time whether telling the truth is worth dying for, subscribe to this channel, because that moment is coming. And the man who has to make that choice didn't start out as anyone's idea of a hero. He was just a rancher who noticed something he wasn't supposed to notice, followed a trail he wasn't supposed to follow, and saw something that changed the rest of his life in the space of a single afternoon. Hit the like button. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with me, because what happens next will make you ask yourself, what would I have done? The cattle didn't belong there. That was the first thing Caleb Voss thought when he crested the low ridge on the western edge of his property and looked down into the shallow draw below. It was a Tuesday in late October, the sky the color of old iron, and he'd ridden out to check the fence line after one of his hands mentioned a post had rotted through near the creek. There were 40, maybe 50 head down in that draw, clustered in the shade of a dry wash where a stand of mesquite had grown too dense for easy visibility from the main road. They weren't his. He knew every animal on his land the way he knew the creases in his own hands. He sat in the saddle for a long moment and said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to. Just him and the gray mare and the sound of wind moving through scrub grass. He should have turned around. He knew that later. He should have told himself it was a stray herd pushed off a neighboring spread, ridden back to his place, eaten supper, and slept the night without any new weight on his chest. He was 34 years old, he ran 212 head on 460 acres, and he had enough trouble keeping his operation in the black without borrowing anyone else's problems. But the brands were wrong. He rode down slow, keeping the mare calm, and got close enough to read them. The animals carried a mark he didn't recognize, a double-bar brand that looked recent, maybe 3 weeks old, still showing the slight discoloration of fresh scar tissue. But beneath it, visible if you got close and looked at the angle of old hide and the ghost of older scarring, was a different mark, an H/. He knew that brand. That was Hector Murrieta's cattle from the spread 14 miles south. Hector had been complaining for 2 months that he was losing animals to a hole in his fence he couldn't find. Caleb stared at the double-bar brand for a long time. Then he pulled out his knife and used the flat of the blade to press the hide in a way that sometimes showed the undermark more clearly in low light. The H/ was there. No question about it. These animals had been rebranded. Stolen cattle held in a draw on the edge of his own land, behind a stand of brush dense enough that you'd never see them from the road. His mouth went dry. He was not a man who looked for trouble. That was something he'd decided about himself early, and held to with the kind of quiet stubbornness that other people sometimes mistook for weakness. His father, Gideon Voss, had been a different kind of man, a man built for the violent edge of frontier life, who'd spent 20 years of it with a gun on his hip and a reputation that followed him like his own shadow. Caleb had watched what that life cost. He'd seen what it did to a man's sleep, a man's hands, a man's ability to sit at a supper table without checking the door twice. When he was 19, he'd told himself he would build something quieter, something that wouldn't follow him into his dreams. He'd spent 15 years keeping that promise to himself. Now he was sitting on a gray mare in a draw full of stolen cattle. And the thing about finding something like this, the thing nobody tells you, is that you can't unfind it. The knowledge was already in him. He already knew. He rode further into the draw, deeper than he should have, following the fence line of his own property toward the canyon mouth at the western end. The herd thinned out as the draw narrowed, the ground turning rocky, the mesquite giving way to harder scrub. He almost turned back. Then he heard voices. Not close. Maybe 200 yards ahead, around a bend in the canyon wall. Male voices, low and unhurried, the sound of men who were comfortable where they were. He dismounted, tied the mare to a branch, and went on foot. What he found in that canyon was not a small operation. There were more animals, a lot more. He counted rough, because counting carefully would have taken too long and the light was failing. Somewhere north of 300 head, penned in a natural enclosure formed by canyon walls on 3 sides, and a rough log and wire fence on the 4th. There was a fire, a lean-to shelter with bedrolls visible inside, a rope line with gear hanging from it, 4 men that he could see. Maybe more he couldn't. One of the men was someone he recognized, Silas Crowe. Caleb knew Crowe the way everyone in Maston County knew him, by reputation and by sight, but not by any close acquaintance that anyone with sense would seek out. Crowe was 40, maybe 45, with a long jaw and pale eyes, and the particular manner of a man who had never, not once in his adult life, been required to back down from anything. He ran what he described as a land brokering and cattle trading business. Most people in the county suspected the word trading covered a broader range of activity than was strictly legal. But suspicion is not the same as evidence, and men like Silas Crowe understood that distinction very well. He was standing at the edge of the herd, talking to one of his men, and Caleb watched him from behind a jut of canyon wall for approximately 90 seconds before he decided he had seen enough. He backed away slowly. He made no sound. He retrieved the mare and rode home in the dark, and the whole way back he was trying to convince himself that this was something he could set aside, that it wasn't his problem, that he had a ranch to run and a crew to pay and a fence post that still needed replacing, that whatever Silas Crowe was doing in that canyon, it was between Crowe and whoever owned those cattle, and none of it had to touch Caleb Voss at all. He was almost convinced by the time he reached his barn. Then he thought about Hector Murrieta, who was 62 years old and had worked that southern spread since before Caleb was born, and who'd lost enough animals in the past season that he'd had to let one of his hands go. And he thought about the other brands he might have seen but hadn't stopped long enough to read, and what they represented in terms of other men's losses and other families' difficulty. He put his horse up. He went inside. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time. In the morning, he rode to town and told the sheriff what he'd seen. Dale Pruitt listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things Caleb had always respected about him. When Caleb finished, the sheriff sat back in his chair, looked at the ceiling, and let out a slow breath. "You went into the canyon," Pruitt said. Not a question. More like a man confirming something he wished he was hearing differently. "I did. And you're certain it was Crowe?" "I've seen the man a dozen times. I'm certain." Pruitt turned his coffee cup around in his hands. It was an old habit, something he did when he was thinking. Caleb had seen him do it enough times to know it meant the situation was being weighed, not dismissed. "I'll need to go out there and look myself before I can do anything official," Pruitt said finally. "You understand that?" "I do. And in the meantime, I'd strongly suggest you don't mention this to anyone. Not your hands, not your neighbors, nobody." "I wasn't planning to." The sheriff looked at him across the desk. Something in his expression was not quite comfortable, not dishonest, just careful in the way of a man who had seen what happened to people who moved too fast against the wrong enemies. "Caleb, this is Silas Crowe. I want to be straight with you about what that means. If we're going to make anything stick, we're going to need to do this right. No mistakes." "I understand that." "Do you?" Pruitt set the cup down. "Because there's a difference between understanding it, the way you're understanding it right now, sitting in my office, and understanding it the way you'll need to understand it if this goes wrong." Caleb held the man's gaze. "I'll take my chances." He rode home. He told nobody. He went about his work. For 3 days, nothing happened. On the morning of this 4th day, he looked out his front window before breakfast and saw 7 riders coming up his road. He recognized Crowe at the head of the group immediately. The other 6 were men he didn't know by name, but he knew the type, the lean, hard-eyed kind of men who had chosen their employment based on what it permitted them to do rather than what it paid. They rode without urgency, which was somehow worse than if they'd been riding hard. Men in a hurry have a destination, Men moving that slowly already believe they've arrived. Caleb's first instinct was the shotgun on the wall. His second instinct was to think clearly about how many of them there were and what a shotgun would and would not accomplish against those odds. He stepped outside onto the porch instead, empty-handed, and waited. Crowe pulled up at the foot of the porch steps and looked down at him with an expression that was almost civil. Almost. "Voss?" he said. "Crowe. Mind if we come in and talk?" "You can talk from there." Crowe smiled. It was the kind of smile a man uses when he's decided to be patient for exactly as long as it serves him. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, leaned down, and held it out. "Why don't you take a look at that?" Caleb took it. He unfolded it. He read it. It was a sworn statement, notarized, with a seal he didn't recognize, identifying one Caleb Voss as the primary organizer of a systematic cattle theft operation in Maston County, operating out of a canyon on his own land, with 3 named co-conspirators and a list of allegedly stolen animals that filled 2 pages. The language was official and precise and entirely, comprehensively false. He read it twice. His hands were steady. He was somewhat surprised by that. "Where'd you get this made?" he asked. "Don't concern yourself with that." "Seems like I should." Crowe straightened in the saddle. The patience in his expression had a ceiling, and Caleb could see they were getting close to it. "Sign it. We'll take it to Pruitt. You'll pay a fine, and that'll be the end of it. No trial, no public hearing, no unpleasant conversations about what was or wasn't found in whose canyon. You want me to confess to crimes I didn't commit. I want this to be quiet and finished." Crowe let a beat pass. "You don't sign it. I take it to Pruitt anyway, and I've got 6 men who'll swear on their mothers they saw you running those animals. Then it's your word against theirs, and you know how that arithmetic works." Caleb looked down at the paper again. Then he folded it carefully, crease by crease, and held it back out toward Crowe. "I won't sign it," he said. The silence that followed was not long, but it had weight. One of the 6 men shifted in his saddle. Another spit into the dirt beside his horse's front hoof. Crowe looked at Caleb with the expression of a man recalculating, deciding what the next step was going to look like now that the easy path had been declined. "You're making a mistake," Crowe said. "Probably." Caleb let his arm drop, the folded paper still in his hand. "But it's mine to make." They didn't leave. That was the part Caleb hadn't fully thought through in the moment of refusal. He'd imagined, in some vague and optimistic recess of his mind, that standing firm would be the end of the scene, that Crowe would acknowledge the refusal, reassess, and ride away to find another angle. That was not what happened. What happened was that 2 of the 6 men dismounted and walked up onto his porch, and the understanding became very clear, very quickly, that the conversation was not over. They didn't hit him. Not yet. They positioned themselves on either side of the porch doorway and let their presence do the work that words were apparently done doing. One of them was a wide, flat-faced man who smelled of horse and tobacco and something metallic that Caleb associated with a certain kind of casual violence. The other was younger, thinner, with quick eyes and the unhurried hands of someone accustomed to using them. Crowe dismounted. He came up the steps slowly, took the paper back from Caleb's hand without asking, unfolded it on the porch railing, and smoothed it flat. He produced a pen from his coat pocket and set it down next to the paper. "One more chance," he said quietly, "before this gets inconvenient for everybody." Caleb looked at the paper. He looked at the pen. He looked at Crowe's face, which had abandoned the pretense of patience entirely and was now simply the face of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted and mildly annoyed that this particular morning was taking longer than planned. "No," Caleb said. The wide man hit him on the right side, below the ribs. Not a killing blow, a persuasion blow. The kind designed to communicate capability rather than intent. Caleb went into the porch railing and caught himself on it, bent forward, breathing. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Crowe said. Caleb straightened. His side was screaming. He looked Crowe in the eye. "The answer is no," he said. "It's going to stay no." Something shifted in Crowe's expression. Not anger. Something colder than anger. The look of a man who has decided to move from phase 1 of a plan to phase 2. "All right," Crowe said. He folded the paper and put it back in his coat. He picked up the pen and returned it to his pocket. He turned to his men. "Tear this place apart. I want every head of cattle accounted for and driven to the holding pen by sundown. And somebody get into his paperwork, deeds, bills of sale, anything with his name on it." The men moved. Caleb stood on the porch with his hand pressed to his ribs and watched them spread across his property like water finding its level. They went into his barn. They went into the outbuilding where he kept his records and tools. Two of them started cutting his fence line on the east pasture, working efficiently and without any apparent awareness of what months of labor that fence represented. Crowe looked at him from the porch railing. "This is what not signing looks like," he said. "Still think it was the right call?" Caleb said nothing. He was doing arithmetic of his own. He was thinking about where his 3 ranch hands were, 2 of them on the north pasture, 1 in town picking up supplies. He was thinking about what was in the house, what could be locked, and what couldn't, what was replaceable and what wasn't. I was thinking about his mother, who lived 3 days' ride east and who had been worried about him in the particular quiet way she had ever since he'd sent her a letter last week mentioning that things on the land had gotten complicated. She'd written back asking what he meant by complicated. He hadn't answered yet. He was also thinking, though he tried not to, about his father. Gideon Voss, 63 years old, living on a small place up north near the territories. A man who had left the violent part of his life behind by sheer force of will and was spending his last years trying to become someone his son didn't have to be ashamed of. A man who would know, instinctively, what to do in exactly this situation. A man whose skills Caleb had spent 15 years refusing to learn, because learning them meant accepting that this kind of moment was always possible. His father would not have been standing empty-handed on this porch. The thought was not comforting. One of Crowe's men came out of the outbuilding carrying a box of Caleb's records. Land deeds, cattle registries, bills of sale going back 8 years. He loaded it onto a pack horse without ceremony. "Those are my legal documents," Caleb said, his voice flat. "They're evidence," Crowe said pleasantly. "Of what?" "Whatever the story needs them to be evidence of." He said it with the ease of a man who had long ago made peace with the distance between what was true and what was useful. "You had your chance to write the story yourself. Now I'll write it." The longest hour of Caleb's life was the one that followed. He stood, or sat, or paced the limited geography of his own porch, while Crowe's men went through his property with systematic thoroughness. They weren't random about it. This wasn't a rage-driven destruction. It was deliberate and organized in the way of men who had done this before, who understood that the goal was not to ruin, but to restructure, to take a man's life apart and reassemble it in a shape that served a different narrative. His foreman, a weathered man named Pete Aldridge, came riding in from the north pasture around mid-morning and pulled up at the edge of the yard with the immediate, wordless assessment of a man who had lived long enough to read a scene without being told what was in it. He looked at the riders. He looked at Caleb on the porch. He looked at the man by the fence with his hand on his rifle. Caleb caught his eye and gave the smallest possible shake of his head. "Go. Stay back. Don't." Pete held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back north at an unhurried pace that would not invite reaction, and Caleb understood that Pete was going to town, and that was probably the smartest thing either of them could have arranged. Crowe noticed. Of course he did. "Friend of yours?" "Ranch hand." "He going somewhere?" "He works the north pasture." Crowe watched the retreating horse for a moment. "If he goes to Pruitt," he said, that just accelerates the timeline. I've got statements ready to file. Pruitt gets my version before he gets yours, and a sheet of paper with a legal seal on it carries more weight than a rancher's say-so. You ought to understand that." Caleb understood it. He also understood that Pete Aldridge had been riding these frontier roads since before Caleb was born, and he knew which horse was faster and which trails cut time, and the fact that Crowe's men hadn't followed him meant that Crowe either didn't see the risk or didn't consider it a risk worth managing. That was a calculation Caleb chose to hold quietly. The sun moved. The work continued. At some point, mid-afternoon, the light going thin and gold, Crowe came and stood beside Caleb on the porch and looked out at what his men had accomplished. The east pasture fence was cut in 3 places. Most of Caleb's cattle had been driven south toward the canyon holding pen. The outbuilding had been thoroughly searched and several boxes of documents removed. The barn had been gone through, though nothing there seemed to be of use to them. "I want you to know," Crowe said, in the tone of a man offering something he considered a courtesy, that this didn't have to go this way. No, Caleb agreed. It didn't. You saw something you shouldn't have seen, and you made a decision that I gave you every opportunity to walk back from. He paused. Most men walk it back. I'm sure they do. Crowe looked at him sidelong. There was something in his expression that might have been, in a different man, a grudging acknowledgement. What makes you think you're different? Caleb thought about it for a moment. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer, even if the answer was for himself more than for Crowe. I don't think I'm different, he said finally. I just think some things are more important than being comfortable. Crowe made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That's a young man's answer. I'm not that young. You're young enough. He pushed off the railing and turned toward the steps. I'll give you one more night. Sleep on it, because tomorrow I file those papers, and after that there's no version of this that ends without a trial and a ruined name, whether or not I can make the charges stick. He descended the steps. And I can make them stick, Voss. I've done it before. Men with better resources than you have lost to worse cases than the one I can build. He mounted up. His men gathered. They rode out as they'd ridden in, without urgency, without looking back, with the unhurried confidence of men who did not consider the matter in any doubt. Caleb stood on his porch until they were gone from sight. Then he sat down on the top step, put his elbows on his knees, and held his face in his hands for a long moment. His cattle were mostly gone. His records were gone. His fence was cut. He had no signed confession to offer Crowe, which meant the forged one would be filed in the morning. He had Pete Aldridge riding toward town, but whether Pete got to Pruitt first or Crowe's paperwork did was anybody's guess. He had an injured side that would be stiff and sore by morning. What he did not have was any regret about refusing to sign. He sat there until the evening started coming on, bringing with it the specific cold of a Texas October. And he thought about his father. Not the legend of him, the stories other men told, which Caleb had spent his life trying not to inherit. He thought about the actual man, the way Gideon Voss had smelled of horses and pipe smoke, the way his hands had looked doing ordinary tasks, fixing a gate, trimming a lamp wick, folding a map, the way he'd laughed at a bad joke and immediately tried to pretend he hadn't. The human parts, the ordinary parts, that the legend always covered over. He wondered what Gideon would think of him right now. Not the gunslinger's assessment, he knew that one, could write it himself. He wondered what the man would think of his son. The man, sitting on a porch with nothing but his word between himself and a very organized enemy. He thought, with a certainty that surprised him in its steadiness, he'd think I did the right thing. Then he went inside, ate a cold supper, and tried to get a few hours of sleep before whatever tomorrow was going to bring. He didn't know that 300 miles east, his mother had read his letter a second time that afternoon, had folded it carefully, had sat for a long while at her own kitchen table, and had then gone to the door of the next room and said, quietly and without preamble, the name of a man she hadn't spoken to in 4 years. He didn't know that the man had listened, had asked one question, had stood up, had started saddling his horse before she finished answering. He didn't sleep well, which wasn't surprising. What was surprising was that he slept at all. He woke before dawn with his side aching from where the wide man had hit him, a deep bruise working its way through the muscle. He lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the sounds of his own house, the settle of old wood, wind pushing at the shutters, the distant movement of what few Cattle Crow's men hadn't managed to drive off. Normal sounds. His sounds. The sounds of a life he'd built with his own hands over 15 years of unglamorous, unromantic work. He got up, started a fire, put coffee on, and stood at the kitchen window while it heated. The yard was empty. The east pasture fence was still cut, 3 gaps in it that would need posts and wire and a full day's work to repair. The outbuilding door hung slightly open from where Crow's men had gone through it without caring about how they left things. He drank his coffee black and thought about what he actually had. He had his word. He had whatever Pete Aldridge had managed to do yesterday. He had the memory of what he'd seen in that canyon, the H/brand under the double bar, the rough count of 300 head, Crow's face in the firelight. He had no documents to back any of it, because the documents were in a box on a pack horse somewhere south of his property line. What he did not have was a plan beyond the one he'd already set in motion, which was to tell the truth and trust that the truth was worth something in a county where Silas Crowe had been operating with impunity for the better part of a decade. That was either courage or stupidity, and at 5 in the morning, with a bruised rib and an empty pasture, the line between the two was not as clear as it had seemed the day before. He was on his second cup when he heard a horse coming up the road. Not 7 horses. 1. He went to the window and looked out, and after a moment he recognized Pete Aldridge coming in at a pace that communicated urgency without panic. A man riding hard but not recklessly, the kind of pace you maintain when you have something important to say and you don't want to say it to a lathered horse in a ditch. Caleb met him at the porch. Pete pulled up, dismounted in one motion, and tied the horse to the rail with hands that weren't quite steady. He was a man of 50-something, raw-boned and weathered, not given to dramatics. The look on his face was not drama. It was something more controlled than that. The look of a man who has processed a difficult situation and arrived at the part where he delivers the information. "Pruitt's got the papers," Pete said without preamble. "Crowe filed them yesterday evening, about an hour after I got to town. I was in the office when the rider came in." Caleb felt the cold of it settle into his chest. "What did Pruitt say?" "He said he was obligated to investigate. He said—" Pete paused, choosing his words. "He said it puts him in a difficult position. That was the phrase he used, difficult position. Meaning Crowe got there first. Meaning Crowe got there first and had 3 witnesses named and a document with a notary seal and a list of cattle that looks, on paper, like you've been running an operation out of that West Canyon for at least 18 months. Pete pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands. "Caleb, it's detailed. Whoever put that together knew what they were doing. It's not some scrawled accusation. It reads like a legal brief." Caleb leaned against the porch post. He said nothing for a moment, working through it. "Did Pruitt believe it?" "I don't know what Pruitt believes. I know what Pruitt is going to do, which is come out here and formally ask you some questions. Probably today." Pete looked at him directly. "And I know that Crowe has 6 men who are apparently prepared to swear in front of a judge that they personally witnessed you moving stolen cattle. 6 men, Caleb, against your word. My word and what I actually saw in that canyon. Which you can't prove you saw because you went in alone and you came out alone and the only thing you brought back was your own account of it." Caleb knew all of this. He'd lain awake working through it. Hearing it spoken aloud by Pete in the gray morning light, in the concrete language of a man who wasn't given to softening things, was different from working through it in the dark. It had more weight, spoken. It had corners to it. "What about Hector Murrieta?" Caleb said. "Those were his brands under the double bar. If someone goes out there and looks, the canyon's empty." That stopped him. "What?" "I rode out before I came here." Pete held his gaze. "Canyon's empty. Whoever was using it moved everything out. Fire's cold, lean-to's still there, but stripped down to the poles. No animals, no gear, no sign of anything beyond boot prints and horse droppings." He paused. "They knew you'd report it. They cleared out before Pruitt could get out there." Caleb stared at him. The whole structure of what he'd planned, the evidence in the canyon, the visible brands, the physical proof that would corroborate his account, was gone. Cleared out with the efficiency of men who had anticipated exactly this sequence of events. Report to sheriff. Sheriff investigates. Canyon empty. Accuser left with nothing but his story. "They were always going to do this," Caleb said, more to himself than to Pete. "The forged confession, the canyon cleanup. They were ready for me. Looks that way. They knew I went to Pruitt before I even left his office." Pete was quiet for a moment. "That's what it looks like." The implication of that sat between them without either of them naming it directly. Someone in or near the sheriff's office had passed word to Crowe. That was the only way the timeline worked. Which meant the problem was not simply Silas Crowe and 6 armed men. The problem had roots that went deeper than a canyon and a herd of stolen cattle. "All right," Caleb said. He straightened off the porch post. "Go get some breakfast. I need to think." Pete looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who wants to say something else and is deciding whether this is the right time for it. He apparently decided it wasn't and went inside. Caleb sat down on the porch step and looked at his property. The cut fence, the emptied pasture, the open outbuilding door, the physical evidence of what one day with Silas Crowe had done to 15 years of work. He thought about signing. Not seriously. He'd made that decision, and he wasn't the type to unmake it once it was made. But he thought about it the way a man thinks about a road he decided not to take, turning it over enough to be sure he understood what it meant to keep walking in the direction he'd chosen. Signing would end the immediate pressure. It would mean a fine he could probably pay, a mark on his name that would fade with time, and a future in which Silas Crowe continued operating his network of stolen cattle, while men like Hector Murrieta continued losing animals they couldn't afford to lose. It would mean Caleb Voss had been in a position to stop something and had chosen not to, because the stopping was costly and the alternative was comfortable enough. He couldn't do it. He'd known that from the moment he read the forged document on his own porch railing. Some things settle in your bones in a way that removes the question from the realm of deliberation. What he needed was not a reason to fight. He had that already. What he needed was something to fight with. Pruitt arrived mid-morning, alone, which Caleb took as a small sign. A man coming to plant a flag brings witnesses. A man coming to have an honest conversation comes by himself. The sheriff dismounted, tied his horse, and came up the porch steps with the careful movement of his bad knee showing more than usual. "You look like you slept about as well as I did," Pruitt said. "Probably worse." They went inside. Caleb put coffee on again, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Pruitt laid a copy of Crowe's filed complaint between them without ceremony. Caleb read through it. It was worse than Pete's summary had suggested. It named him as the operations organizer, identified 3 of his ranch hands, by name, including Pete, as knowing participants, and contained a detailed inventory of allegedly stolen animals, including brands, estimated weights, and dates of acquisition that went back 14 months. The fabrication was thorough. Whoever had constructed it had taken real care. "This is all invented," Caleb said. "I know that," Pruitt said. Caleb looked up at him sharply. "I know you," the sheriff said. "I've known you since you were 20 years old and buying your first head of cattle. I know the kind of man you are, and I know the kind of operation you run." He turned his coffee cup. "That doesn't mean I can make this go away. Crowe filed it properly, through the county clerk, with notarized statements. The law doesn't let me ignore a properly filed complaint because I personally believe the filer is a liar. What does the law let you do? Investigate, ask questions, take statements." He paused. "And if I find evidence that Crowe's complaint is fraudulent, I can refer the matter to the circuit judge and pursue charges against Crowe for filing a false report." He said it the way a man says something that sounds good but carries a weight he wants you to understand. "But that requires evidence. Physical evidence, preferably. Not just your account against his. The canyon's been cleared. I rode out there this morning, yes. He moved everything the night I came to see you. He had someone in your office tell him I'd reported it." Pruitt's expression shifted in a very specific way. Not denial, not offense. Something more uncomfortable than either of those. The look of a man who suspects something he hasn't been able to prove and doesn't want to confirm out loud until he's more certain. That's a significant accusation. I know it is. Have you got any basis for it beyond the timeline? Nothing I can prove. But the timing's the only explanation. He was ready for every move I made. The forged complaint was already prepared when he rode out here yesterday. The canyon was already cleared. He came here with a plan that accounted for me having reported him, which means he knew before he arrived that I'd been to see you. Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. He turned his cup. Outside, the wind moved across the empty pasture. "There's a man who works the front desk on Tuesday evenings," Pruitt said finally, not looking at Caleb. "Name of Harlan Fitch. He's been there about 2 years. I've had questions about him, things that didn't add up. I never had reason to act on it." He stopped. "I'm not confirming anything. I'm telling you that I am going to look at some things more carefully than I have been." "All right. In the meantime, you need to be careful. Not just careful in the general sense. Specifically careful. Crowe doesn't leave loose ends, and right now you are a very visible loose end." He finally looked up. "Is there anyone you trust, outside of this county? Family? Someone who could—" "I can handle my own situation." Pruitt studied him. "I'm sure you believe that. I'm not asking for help." "You're not?" The sheriff's voice was even. "Because from where I'm sitting, you've lost most of your cattle, you've lost your records, you've got a criminal complaint filed against you, and a man with 6 armed riders who has demonstrated he's willing to use them. That sounds like a situation that could use some help." Caleb said nothing. He was not, by nature, a man who admitted vulnerability easily. Another thing he'd inherited from a father he'd spent years trying not to be, which was its own particular irony. He sat with the silence for a moment and let it be what it was. "My father might be coming," he said finally. "My mother may have sent for him." Something crossed Pruitt's face, recognition, and something else he didn't immediately show. "Gideon Voss." "Yes." The sheriff nodded slowly. He didn't say what he was clearly thinking, which Caleb appreciated. He didn't make the observation that Gideon Voss was a man whose reputation in this region was of a specific and unmistakable type. He just nodded. "Good," Pruitt said simply. "That's good." He finished his coffee, stood up, picked up the copy of the complaint, and tucked it back into his coat. He put on his hat. He looked at Caleb from the doorway. "Don't go anywhere alone if you can help it. Keep at least one man with you. And if Crowe or any of his men come back onto this property, you send word immediately. Don't try to manage it yourself." He left. Caleb listened to the sound of his horse going down the road, and then sat in the quiet of his kitchen for a while. The problem he kept returning to was the gap between what he knew was true and what he could demonstrate to be true. The canyon was empty. His records were gone. The 6 men who would testify against him were alive and presumably well rested and not at all troubled by the prospect of lying under oath. And the clock on Crowe's tolerance for complications was not going to run indefinitely. He needed something, some piece of the thing he could actually hold in his hands. He thought about Hector Murrieta, those H/brands under the double bar. That wasn't something you could manufacture from imagination. He'd seen it clearly enough to be certain. And the H/brand was registered, which meant there would be official records of Murrieta's reported losses filed with the county livestock office. That was a thread, thin as it was. He also thought about the men Crowe used. Not the top tier, the loyal ones, the ones who'd ridden out to his ranch with Crowe and shown no hesitation. But operations that size required labor at every level. They needed men to move cattle, run brands, maintain the holding areas. Not all of those men were ideologically committed to Silas Crowe. Some of them were just employed. Employed men sometimes had second thoughts. Employed men sometimes noticed things that troubled their sleep. Employed men, under the right circumstances, occasionally talked. He thought about who in Maston County might have that kind of loose connection to Crowe's operation. Someone low enough in the hierarchy to be nervous, high enough to know something real. A name came to him. He turned it over in his mind, examining it from different angles, deciding whether the idea was sound or desperate. It was probably some of both. Most useful ideas were. Del Craddock ran a small operation on the county's western edge, a scrubby 20-acre place that barely qualified as a ranch, more of a way station, with a reputation for buying and selling cattle at prices that various people in the county considered suspiciously favorable. He was 40, missing the top joint of his right index finger from an accident he gave different accounts of depending on who was asking, and he drank more than was good for him, but not so much that it had stopped him from conducting his business. Caleb had dealt with him twice, years back. Neither transaction had been particularly pleasant, but both had been completed without obvious dishonesty. Craddock was not a man you trusted, but he was a man you could potentially use, if you understood what motivated him, which was primarily his own continued well-being. Caleb rode out in the afternoon, alone despite Pruitt's advice, because taking Pete would have made this conversation impossible. He found Craddock in his yard doing something ineffectual with a fence post that clearly needed replacing rather than repairing. Craddock looked up when Caleb rode in. His expression went through several things in rapid succession: recognition, wariness, calculation. He didn't wave. He waited. Caleb dismounted and tied his horse and walked over, and they stood by the fence post and looked at it together for a moment in the way of men who needed a neutral object to manage the opening of a difficult conversation. "Voss," Craddock said. "Craddock, you're a man with some trouble from what I hear. Word travels fast." "Out here it does." He went back to the fence post, banging at it with a hammer that was too light for the job. "What brings you out?" "Silas Crowe," Caleb said. The hammer stopped. Craddock stood there for a moment with his back to Caleb, and the quality of the stillness was very informative. Then he started hammering again, slightly harder than before. "Don't know what you'd come to me for about that," he said. "I think you do?" "Man runs a cattle trading operation. I've sold animals to his buyers before. Lots of people have. That's not a thing." "Some of those animals weren't originally his to sell," Caleb said. And I think you know that, and I think you've been trying to decide for a while how you feel about it." The hammering stopped again. This time Craddock turned around. His face was complicated, not offended, which Caleb had half expected, but something more honestly troubled. The look of a man who has been carrying a weight he didn't sign up for. "You're asking me to go against Silas Crowe," Craddock said quietly. "I'm not asking you to do anything yet. I'm asking you to talk to me." "That's the same thing, and you know it." He glanced around the yard, an involuntary, instinctive movement, checking for observers. Finding none, he looked back at Caleb. "You know what happens to people who cause Silas Crowe a problem?" "I'm getting a first-hand education." "Then you know why I'm not interested in being part of your situation." "I know why you think you're not interested," Caleb said. "But here's what I'd ask you to consider. Whatever Crowe is doing, and we both know what he's doing, it's gotten big enough now that it's going to end. It might end badly for him, or it might end badly for everyone who is connected to him in any way, no matter how peripheral. When the law finally digs into this, and they will, the question is whether you're someone who cooperated early or someone they find in the pile." Craddock chewed on his lower lip. He looked at the fence post. He looked at his hammer. He looked at Caleb. "I never moved stolen cattle," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "What did you do?" A long pause. The kind that means something is being decided, not just considered. "Bought some animals I should have asked more questions about. Prices were good. I didn't push on where they came from." He said it like a man who has rehearsed this confession enough times in private that it comes out with the practiced cadence of something he's been sitting with for months. 3 times in the last year, small numbers, 6 head once, 4 another time, 9 the last time. From Crowe's buyers. From men I didn't know well, men who Crowe apparently sent my way. He ran a hand over his face. I didn't know the full shape of it at the time. I had ideas. Uncomfortable ideas that I told myself weren't my business. "Hector Murrieta's animals?" Caleb said. Craddock looked at him steadily. "Among others." The weight of that settled between them. The specificity of it. The confirmation that the thing Caleb had seen in the canyon was as large and as ugly as he'd feared. More than one rancher's losses. More than one family. "I need something I can take to Pruitt," Caleb said. "Something physical. Documents. Records of transactions, anything that shows where those animals came from and where they went. And if I give you that, what happens to me? I can't promise you nothing happens to you. What I can tell you is that Pruitt is trying to do this right, and a man who comes forward with information is in a different position than a man who gets found." "That's not much." "No," Caleb agreed. "It's not." Another long silence. A horse somewhere in Craddock's barn shifted its weight, knocking against a stall board. The afternoon light was going long and golden in the way it did in October, making everything look more peaceful than it was. "I've got a ledger," Craddock said finally, very quietly. "My own. I keep records of everything. It's just a habit I've had since I started. Dates, descriptions, prices, who I bought from." He stopped. "The 3 transactions I mentioned, they're in there. With descriptions of the animals. Brands." He paused. "Including, on 2 of them, notes I made at the time about marks that looked like they'd been worked over." Caleb kept very still. "You documented it." "At the time, I told myself it was just good business practice." The bitterness in his voice was directed inward. "Now I don't know what it was." "Can I have it?" "I need to think about that." "You don't have a lot of time to think, Craddock. Crowe filed a complaint against me yesterday. He's moving fast. When he's done with me, he's going to look at every loose connection he has and decide which ones need to be cut." He let that sit for a moment. "You've been uncomfortable with this for a while. That discomfort was right. Now you've got a chance to be on the side of it being right." Craddock looked at him for a long time. He was not a man Caleb particularly liked or trusted, and the feeling was probably mutual. But there was something in his face at that moment that was recognizable. The look of a person who has been living with a compromise they made and finding it heavier than they expected. "Come back tomorrow morning," Craddock said. "Early, before anyone's likely to be watching roads." Caleb nodded. "I'll be here before sunup." He rode home through the last of the afternoon light, thinking about ledgers and brands and the slow machinery of doing something right when everything is set up to make it easier to do nothing. His side still hurt. The pasture was still empty when he got back. Pete had done what he could with the fence, filling 2 of the 3 gaps with rough-cut posts and salvaged wire. That night, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to his mother. Not the kind of letter he'd been writing for years. Carefully worded, abbreviated, the kind designed to reassure without revealing. This one was different. He told her what had happened, all of it. Not because he needed her to do anything, but because he was beginning to understand that the isolation he'd maintained wasn't strength. It was just another kind of pride. He sealed it. He set it aside. He went to sleep. He didn't hear the rider who passed on the road 2 hours after midnight, moving slowly in the direction of Crowe's operation. He didn't know that Craddock, unable to sleep, had spent those 2 hours sitting at his own kitchen table, looking at a ledger he'd kept in a box under his floorboards. He didn't know what Craddock decided, sitting there in the dark with that ledger, or what it cost him to decide it. He found out in the morning. I was already saddled and heading out at first light when Pete stepped out of the bunkhouse and asked where he was going. Caleb told him enough. Not everything, but enough. And Pete's expression went through its familiar sequence of assessment and resignation. You want company? No, I want you here, watching the road. And if Crowe's men come back while you're gone, then you let them look at an empty yard and don't give them anything to act on. He looked at Pete directly. Don't fight them, Pete. Whatever they do to the property, don't fight them. Pete's jaw tightened. That's a hard thing to ask. I know it. He rode. The morning was cold, the sky that clear, brittle blue that only came in the deep part of autumn, and the land was quiet in the way it gets when most of the birds have gone south, and the remaining ones haven't started their morning yet. He rode fast and arrived at Craddock's place as the first real light was breaking over the eastern horizon. The yard was wrong. He knew it before he could name specifically what was wrong. Something in the arrangement of it. The barn door standing open when it should have been latched, Craddock's horse visible outside on a tie line rather than inside, a lamp burning in the front window even though it was light enough to see without one. He pulled up. He sat still. He listened. Then he dismounted, drew the pistol he'd started carrying again after Crowe's first visit, and approached the house carefully. Craddock was inside. He was sitting at his kitchen table, and he was alive. But the condition of the room around him told a story that was not hard to read. The table had been moved. A chair was on its side. One of the kitchen shelves had been partly cleared, jars and tins sitting on the floor rather than on the shelf. Someone had been looking for something. Craddock looked up when Caleb came through the door. His face had the specific emptiness of a man who has been frightened past the point where fear looks like fear and into the place where it looks like calm. They came last night, he said. Caleb put the pistol away. Are you hurt? No, they didn't. He stopped. They weren't rough with me. They were just thorough. He looked at the shelf. They took my ledger. The word landed like a stone in still water. Caleb stood there. How did they know about it? He said. I don't know. Craddock's voice was very flat. I didn't tell anyone. I went to sleep and woke up to them knocking at my door, and they were polite about it, which was almost worse than if they hadn't been. One man, very calm, asked me where I kept my business records. I told him I didn't know what he meant. He explained that he wasn't there to hurt me, just to retrieve some documentation that Mr. Crowe had an interest in. He stopped, swallowed. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Caleb pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. There was something happening here that was bigger than he'd measured. Crowe didn't just have a man in the sheriff's office. He had eyes across the county, enough visibility into the movements and communications of people in his orbit that a single conversation in a yard on a Tuesday afternoon had been known to him by 2 in the morning. That was not a simple operation. That was infrastructure. That was something that had been building for years. The ledger is gone, Caleb said. Yes. You don't have copies? No. He thought for a moment. The brands you noted, the ones that looked worked over. You remember which of the 3 transactions those were from? Craddock looked at him. Something in his expression shifted. Not hope exactly, but the slight softening of a man who has been sitting in the belief that everything is lost and is being shown a possible exception. The second and third. 6 head the second time, 9 the third. Dates? Second was early July. Third was late August. And the men you bought from? You'd recognize them? One of them I would. The other only dealt with me through a third party. He frowned. The one I'd recognize. I've seen him twice since in town. He works for a feed supplier near the southern end of Main Street. Young man, maybe 25, red hair, scar on his chin. Caleb filed that. All right, he said. All right. What are you going to do? The honest answer was that he didn't know yet. What he had now was less than what he'd had yesterday. The ledger gone, Craddock frightened and exposed, his own situation unchanged. But what he'd also confirmed was the scale and the reach of what Crowe was running. And scale like that left traces. It left people who knew things, even if they didn't know they knew them. It left records in other offices, other ledgers, other memories. He was going to have to find them. Carefully, quickly, with fewer resources than his opponent, and probably less time than he needed. I'm going to keep pulling threads, he said, and you're going to stay here, stay quiet, and not move your money or your animals or do anything that looks like you're preparing to go somewhere. Craddock looked at him. You think they're watching me? I think they're watching everything. And a man who starts moving things looks like a man who's about to run or about to do something, and either of those will bring them back here a lot less politely than last night. He stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at Craddock, a man he didn't like particularly, who had made bad choices for comprehensible reasons, who was now frightened and slightly more honest than he'd been before all of this started. I'm sorry this came to your door, Caleb said. Craddock shook his head. It was at my door before you got here. I just hadn't opened it yet. He rode back to his ranch through the growing morning, and the emptiness of his pastures made a sound on him that had changed overnight. It wasn't just the losses anymore, the cattle, the records, the leverage. It was the knowledge of the thing's size, the roots of it, going down into the county in ways he hadn't imagined. The fact that his decision to tell the truth had set him against something far larger than a canyon full of stolen cattle. He thought, pulling into his yard and seeing Pete standing by the barn with the look of a man who had been watching the road all morning. I needed my father 30 years ago to teach me how to fight. I should have let him. And then, under that, but I didn't, so I'll learn now. He dismounted. He handed the reins to Pete. He went inside to think about the young man with red hair and a scar on his chin who worked near the southern end of Main Street, and whether he was the kind of person who was in this by choice, or the kind who was in it because nobody had ever given him a clear view of what the choice actually was. Somewhere to the north, on a road he hadn't taken in years, a man who had once been one of the most dangerous gunfighters on the Texas frontier was riding south through the early morning cold, and he was riding fast, and he had a long way to go, but he was going. The young man's name was Tommy Reese, and he was 24 years old, and he had no idea that the thread Caleb was following had an end that led directly to him. Caleb spent most of that day not riding into town, which took more discipline than it sounds. Every instinct he had said, move faster, press harder, get to Tommy Reese before Crowe's network figured out that Craddock had talked and started pulling its own threads tight. But moving fast and moving smart were not always the same direction, and he'd already made enough costly mistakes to understand the difference. So he sat at his kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and worked through what he actually knew versus what he suspected, and tried to build something solid from the material he had. What he knew, Tommy Reese had sold cattle to Del Craddock on at least 2 occasions. The animals had been rebranded. Craddock had recorded brands that showed signs of having been worked over. Tommy Reese worked at a feed supplier near the southern end of Main Street. What he suspected, Tommy Reese was a low-level mover in Crowe's operation. Not a decision-maker, not a planner. The kind of young man who got pulled into something because the money was better than what honest work paid, and the consequences felt abstract until they didn't. What he needed. Something that connected Tommy Reese to Crowe in a way that didn't depend on a ledger that no longer existed, and something that could be put in front of Dale Pruitt with enough specificity that Pruitt could act on it regardless of what Crowe had already filed. The problem with approaching Tommy Reese directly was the same problem that had cost Craddock his ledger. Crowe had ears. Whoever had known about Caleb's conversation in Craddock's yard, and they'd known it within hours, was still out there, still listening. Walking up to one of Crowe's men in broad daylight on Main Street was not a conversation. It was an announcement. Pete knocked on the kitchen door frame in the late afternoon. He had 2 cups of fresh coffee and the expression of a man who has been thinking and has arrived at something he wants to say. Sit down, Caleb said. Pete sat. He pushed one of the cups across the table. He looked at the window for a moment, organizing himself. "Tommy Reese," he said. Caleb looked at him. "I know who he is," Pete said. "We were never close, but I know him. Grew up 2 counties over, came here maybe 3 years back. His older brother ran with some rough men up near the territories before he got himself shot over a card game." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Tommy's not like that, or at least he wasn't when he came here. He's the kind of young man who makes practical decisions without thinking very far ahead about where practical decisions lead. You think he could be talked to?" "I think he's scared." Pete said it simply. "I saw him 2 weeks ago in town. We didn't speak, but I know a scared man when I look at one, and that boy was scared. Not in the way of someone who's done something and gotten away with it. In the way of someone who's done something and is waiting for it to find him." Caleb thought about that. "That's a man who's looking for a door." "That's what I thought too. I can't approach him directly. Crowe will know before I get back to my horse." Pete nodded slowly. He turned his cup. He had something else he was getting to, and he was getting there in his own time, which was how Pete always worked. You could push him, and he'd just stop talking entirely, so you learned to wait. "There's a woman named Clara Fitch," Pete said, "Harlan Fitch's wife. The man Pruitt mentioned, the one who works the sheriff's desk." Caleb went very still. "She takes her laundry to the wash house on Weller Street every Thursday morning," Pete continued. "Tommy Reese's mother runs that wash house." He looked at Caleb steadily. "Tommy goes in to help his mother 2, sometimes 3 mornings a week, usually early before his shift at the feed supplier." The shape of it settled into place slowly, the way things do when you've been staring at a problem long enough that the solution stops looking like a solution and starts looking like the only obvious thing. "You're not suggesting I go to the wash house," Caleb said. "I'm suggesting that a man who needs to have a quiet conversation with Tommy Reese, without it looking like a man who needs to have a quiet conversation with Tommy Reese, might find a way to be there when Tommy is there, in a context that looks ordinary." "And Clara Fitch?" "Clara Fitch goes home and tells her husband everything. That's just the kind of woman she is. Not malicious, just a talker. If she sees you there, Harlan knows by midday." Pete paused. "So you go early, before she arrives. You get Tommy alone, or as alone as a wash house gets, and you have 10 minutes before the rest of the morning's customers start coming in." Caleb looked at him. "You've been thinking about this all day?" "Since about 7 this morning," Pete admitted. "I didn't know if it was useful. I wasn't sure you'd found anything at Craddock's place worth using." "I found that the ledger's gone and Craddock's frightened," Caleb said, "and that Tommy Reese is someone Craddock bought from twice, with documentation of suspicious brands that Crowe apparently knew about and retrieved last night." Pete absorbed that. His jaw tightened slightly, the only tell he had for anger. "So Crowe's already cut that thread." "He thinks he has." But Craddock remembered the details. Dates, numbers, descriptions. Not in a form I can put in front of a judge, but enough to know what questions to ask someone who was actually there. He looked at his coffee. "If Tommy Reese was one of the men moving those animals, and I think he was, then he knows things that no ledger can replace. He was there. He handled the brands. He dealt with the buyers. That's not something Crowe can retrieve from under a floorboard." They sat with that for a moment, the two of them and the quiet kitchen and the failing afternoon light coming through the west window. "Thursday's tomorrow," Pete said. "I know." "You should sleep tonight, actually sleep." "I'll try." Caleb looked at him. "Pete, what you're doing, staying here, working this with me, I haven't said enough about that." Pete shook his head. "You don't need to say anything about it." "I do. Crowe named you in that complaint. You're in this now whether you wanted to be or not, and that's because of me, and I want you to know that I understand what that costs." Pete was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful in the way of a man saying something true that he doesn't want to overstate. "I've been working ranches my whole life. 40 years, give or take. I've worked for good men and bad men and men who were somewhere in between, and the thing you learn is that the character of the man you work for matters more than the wages." He stood up, picked up his cup. "You told the truth when lying would have been easier. That's not nothing. I'm not going to walk away from that." He went back outside. Caleb sat alone in the kitchen for a while, and the thing he felt was not quite comfort, but something adjacent to it. The specific warmth of not being entirely alone in a situation designed to isolate. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. He slept better than he expected. The wash house on Weller Street opened at 6 in the morning, which meant Caleb needed to be in town before that, waiting, without looking like he was waiting. He left the ranch at 4:30, told Pete where he was going, and rode in through the east approach rather than the main road, coming in at the back end of town, where the older buildings crowded together and the streets were still dark and mostly empty. He tied his horse at the livery on the far end of the block and walked, keeping to the side streets, feeling the cold of the early morning through his coat. His ribs had settled into a constant low ache that sharpened when he moved a certain way and faded when he stayed still. He was managing it. The wash house was a long, low building with a chimney that already had smoke coming from it at 5:50. The fire started early to heat the water. A light was on inside. Through the small window beside the door, he could see the movement of someone working, a woman, broad-shouldered and efficient, moving between basins with the rhythm of someone who had done this particular work for enough years that her body had memorized it. Tommy Reese came around the corner of the building at 6:05 from the alley behind it, carrying a basket of firewood. He was about what Caleb had expected from the description. Young, lean, red-haired, with a scar on his chin that pulled slightly when he set his jaw. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had not been sleeping well for a sustained period. He saw Caleb and stopped. Caleb didn't move toward him. He stayed where he was, leaning against the wall of the building across the narrow street, and he kept his hands visible and his posture as non-threatening as a man his size could manage. "I'm not here to hurt you," Caleb said quietly. "I'm not armed for this conversation. I need 10 minutes. Tommy looked at him. He looked at the wash house door. He looked at the alley behind him, calculating, and Caleb could see him running through it, whether running was better than talking, what each option cost him. "You're Voss," Tommy said. "Yes." "Crowe said you'd probably come looking for people to talk to." His voice was careful, young, trying to sound steadier than he was. "Said if anyone approached me, I should let him know." "Are you going to?" A pause, long enough to mean something. "I haven't decided yet." "Then we've got the same amount of time," Caleb said. 10 minutes. Whatever you decide after that, you decide after that." Tommy looked at him for a long moment. Then he set down the firewood basket slowly and crossed the street. He stopped a few feet away and crossed his arms over his chest. A defensive posture, but he'd crossed the street. That was the decision that mattered. "I know about the 2 transactions with Del Craddock," Caleb said. "July and August. 6 head, then 9. I know the brands were worked. I know you were the man Craddock dealt with directly, at least once." Tommy's jaw tightened. The scar pulled. "Craddock's ledger is gone. Crowe had it retrieved 2 nights ago." He watched the information land. "So that's not your problem. Your problem is that Craddock remembers the transactions without the ledger, and I've now heard his account directly. And what I heard tells me enough about the scope of what Crowe is running that I'm going to keep pulling threads until I find something that survives Crowe's cleanup." Tommy was very still. "What do you want from me?" "I want to know how big it is, not the names of everyone involved. I'm not building a list to hand to Crowe so he can figure out who's a liability. I want to understand the operation, how long it's been running, how many ranches it's pulled from, how the rebranding works, where the animals go after they leave the holding areas." He looked at the young man steadily. "Because right now Silas Crowe has filed a complaint that says I'm the one running this thing, and the only way I survive that is by giving Pruitt something real enough to overturn it. And what happens to me if I talk? I can't guarantee anything. I won't insult you by pretending I can. That's honest, at least. The honest version is this: you're already in it. The ledger being gone doesn't make you safe. It just removes one piece of documentation. Crowe knows what you've done for him, which means he also knows what you could say about him. Men in that position don't get protected forever. They get used until they're a risk, and then they get managed." Tommy looked at the street. Something was working in his face. Not simple fear anymore, but a more complicated emotion. The kind that comes when you've been living with a decision you made and the weight of it has been building for long enough that the relief of putting it down starts to outweigh the cost. "I got into it because the money was good," Tommy said very quietly. I didn't think through where it went. I moved some cattle. I handled some brands. I passed some animals to buyers that I didn't ask hard questions about." He stopped. "And then I was in it. And the thing about being in it with a man like Crowe is that Getting out isn't something you just decide to do. I know. No, you don't. He said it without hostility, just correction. You found something and you reported it, and that was brave or stupid depending on how it ends. But you were never in it. You don't know what it feels like to be in it. Caleb accepted that without argument, because it was true. It's been running for 3 years, Tommy said finally. The full operation. Before that it was smaller. Crowe was moving animals through 2 counties, loose network, nothing organized. 3 years ago he structured it, holding areas in 4 different locations. The canyon on your land was the biggest, but there are 3 others, 1 near Delmont, 2 further west. He was speaking quietly, steadily, like a man reading from a document he'd been writing in his head for a while. The rebranding work is done by a man named Casper Holt, works out of a place that looks like a legitimate livestock operation in Delmont. He's the best brand worker I've ever seen. He can work a mark so clean that you need to know what you're looking for to see the original underneath. How many ranches? Tommy thought about it. That I know of personally, 8. But there are gaps in what I know. I only moved animals in my section of the network. I didn't have visibility into the whole thing. He looked at Caleb. But I know the numbers from my section. Over 18 months, my section moved approximately 450 head from 6 different ranches. If the other sections are comparable, it's in the thousands, Caleb said. Yes. The scale of it was something he'd been working up to, but hearing it stated was different. Thousands of animals, dozens of ranchers, some of whom had probably already failed, sold out, packed up and left because they couldn't understand why their numbers kept dropping and their books couldn't balance. An operation that had been running for 3 years with enough organizational intelligence to stay ahead of every attempt to expose it. Hector Murrieta, Caleb said. One of the 6 I know about, Tommy confirmed. He's lost a lot. The old man, he doesn't know it was systematic. He thinks he's got bad fencing and bad luck. Caleb thought about Hector Murrieta, 62 years old, letting ranch hands go. He thought about the others he didn't know the names of yet, working their spreads and absorbing losses they couldn't explain. I need you to talk to Pruitt, Caleb said. Tommy shook his head immediately. I can't go to Pruitt. Crowe has a man there. Harlan Fitch. Something shifted in Tommy's face. You know about Fitch? Pruitt suspects him. He told me as much. Pruitt suspects him but hasn't acted on it, which means Fitch is still there, still passing information. He uncrossed his arms. If I walk into that office, Crowe knows within the hour. And then I'm not a useful employee with some uncomfortable knowledge. I'm a problem that needs to be solved. Then not Pruitt's office, not in town. Pruitt can come to you, somewhere private, somewhere that doesn't register. And Fitch doesn't find out. Pruitt can manage his own office if he knows what he's managing. What he needs is a reason to act, and right now I'm the only source he has, and I'm the man Crowe is accusing. He needs a second voice. Caleb looked at him. You're that voice. Tommy stood in the early morning street for a long time. The wash house was getting louder. His mother moving between basins, water beginning to heat properly, the first sounds of the day's work picking up. If I do this, he said slowly, and it goes wrong, I know. If Crowe figures out before we're far enough along, I know. You keep saying I know like that's an answer. It's not an answer, Caleb said. It's just the truth. I don't have guarantees. I have the fact that what Crowe is doing is wrong, and that it's costing real people their livelihoods, and that there's enough of it that if someone tells it clearly and completely, the law can't look away. He paused. And I have the fact that you're already afraid, and the thing you're afraid of isn't going away. Crowe's operation is going to surface eventually, and when it does, the question is which side of it you're on. Tommy looked at the street for a long moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Something older and more tired than laughter, the sound a man makes when he's stopped pretending. Tell Pruitt to come to my mother's place Sunday morning, early. She goes to visit her sister Sundays. She leaves before 6. I'll be there alone. He looked at Caleb. And not through any channel that goes near the sheriff's office. You tell him yourself, in person, somewhere that Fitch can't see. I'll manage it. Tommy nodded once, short and final. He picked up the firewood basket. He went inside. Caleb walked back to his horse through streets that were beginning to come alive with the early business of the day. And the whole walk he was acutely aware of being visible, of being a man with newly acquired information in a town that had ears he couldn't see. He moved without urgency. He nodded to the liveryman. He mounted and rode east before turning south, taking the long way around, adding 30 minutes to his ride to avoid the main road and whatever eyes might be watching it. He found Pruitt that afternoon not at the office, but at the man's own small house on the edge of town, where Caleb had been twice before for reasons that had nothing to do with official business. Once to return a borrowed tool, once for a funeral supper 3 years back. Pruitt answered the door in his shirt sleeves and looked at Caleb on his porch and said nothing, just stepped back to let him in. They talked for 40 minutes. Caleb gave him everything. What Craddock had said, what Tommy Reese had said, the 3-year timeline, the 4 holding areas, the name Casper Holt, the estimate of thousands of head across the county. Pruitt listened without interrupting, in his kitchen this time rather than the office, with no paperwork visible and no one else present. When Caleb finished, the sheriff sat back and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "Casper Holt," he said. "You know him?" "I know of him. I've had his name in my head for about a year without anything solid to attach it to." He looked up. "If he's the brand man and we can connect him physically to any of the rebranded animals, even one, that's the kind of evidence that survives a cleanup. You can move cattle. You can burn a ledger. You can't unbrand an animal. The animals Craddock bought, if they're still alive, still in his possession, the original brand is still there under the new one. Faded, but there. Craddock will cooperate?" He's scared, but scared people cooperate when they understand the alternative. Pruitt nodded slowly. "And Tommy Reese?" "Sunday morning, early, at his mother's place. Before 6. I'll come alone. I'll leave my horse 2 streets over and walk." He paused. "I need to tell you something about Fitch." Caleb waited. "I've been watching him for the past 2 days, quietly, nothing he'd notice. Yesterday evening, after I came to see you, after I left your place, he made a trip. Not to anywhere official. He rode about 4 miles south and came back within the hour." The sheriff's voice was flat, controlled. "I followed him far enough to see the direction. It was toward the Crowe operation's main staging area. You didn't confront him. Not yet. A confrontation without evidence just warns them. What I need is to remove him from a position where he can pass information, without tipping Crowe that I know what Fitch has been doing." He turned his coffee cup. "I'm going to tell him tomorrow that I need him to ride out to the western edge of the county to follow up on an unrelated matter. A 3-day job. It'll get him out of the office, out of the information loop, for long enough to get Tommy Reese's statement and start moving on Casper Holt." "And if Fitch refuses?" "He won't refuse. He's not that kind of man. He's the kind that goes along and passes information, not the kind that makes scenes." Pruitt looked at him steadily. "Caleb, this is starting to move. You need to understand that when it moves, it's going to move fast, and Crowe is going to feel it. He's going to feel the shape of what's closing in on him before we have everything we need, and when he does, he's going to look for pressure points. Me. You. And anyone close to you. Your crew. Your property." He paused. "Any family in the area." Caleb thought about the letter he'd written to his mother. "My family's not in the area." "Keep it that way." He rode home in the late afternoon, and the ride was long enough that he had time to think about the structure of what was assembling. It was fragile. Tommy Reese still hadn't committed on paper to anything, and paper was what courts needed. Craddock's memory was evidence of a kind, but not the kind that stood alone. Casper Holt was a name and a location, but not yet a tangible connection. And Crowe still had his filed complaint, his 6 witnesses, and whatever additional pressure he was preparing to apply. The balance hadn't shifted yet. It was moving, but it hadn't shifted. I was half a mile from his own gate when he heard the riders. Not behind him, ahead. He pulled up. The gray mare shifted under him, picking something up that he hadn't quite registered yet. A tension in the air, a quality to the silence that was different from ordinary silence. Then he saw them. 4 men, on the road between him and his gate, sitting still on their horses in the way of men who have been waiting and have now seen what they were waiting for. He recognized one of them, the wide, flat-faced man who had hit him on the porch. He didn't recognize the other 3, but he understood the formation without needing an introduction. He pulled the mare up and sat still. His heart was doing something loud, but his hands were steady, which was the part that mattered. The wide man walked his horse forward a few steps. He didn't reach for his weapon. This wasn't that kind of visit yet. Mr. Crowe wants a conversation, he said. Tonight. Tell Mr. Crowe he knows where I live. He'd prefer somewhere more private. I'll bet he would. Caleb looked at the four of them. The arithmetic was not favorable. Where? Old Delmont Road, the split-rail crossroads, 2 hours after dark. And if I don't come? The wide man looked at him with the patient expression of someone who doesn't need to spell things out. I didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Caleb thought about Pete back at the ranch, alone. He thought about what four men sitting on a road meant as a demonstration of capability. They were between him and his home, and they weren't hiding, which meant being hidden wasn't the point. The point was being seen. 2 hours after dark, Caleb said. The wide man nodded. The four of them moved off the road and Caleb rode through, not hurrying, feeling their eyes on his back all the way to his gate. Pete met him in the yard. He read the situation from Caleb's face without needing an explanation, which was one of Pete's genuinely useful skills. How bad? Pete said. Caleb dismounted. Which means he's got something new. The operation is starting to feel pressure and he's looking for a way to stop it before it builds. You're not going alone. I'm not going at all. He handed the reins over. I'm going to be here, on this property, with you and both hands visible and a lamp in every window. He looked at Pete. Because showing up to a private meeting with Silas Crowe on a dark road is not a conversation. It's a resolution, and not the kind where I get to speak. Pete was quiet for a moment. He's going to take that as an answer. Yes, he is. They went inside. Caleb lit the lamp, so all of them, every room, the house burning like a signal fire in the dark of the Texas evening. He sat at the kitchen table with his pistol on the wood beside him and Pete at the other end with a rifle across his knees, and the night settled in around the bright square of the house like a held breath. 2 hours after dark came and went. Nothing happened. No riders on the road, no sound from the yard, no movement in the dark beyond the lamplit radius of the windows, which was, in its own way, the most frightening thing. Not the violence, the waiting, the patience of a man who had decided he didn't need to rush because he already controlled enough of the variables. It was past midnight when Caleb heard something that made him go still. A different sound from the ordinary nothing, something at the edge of audibility, coming from the direction of the main road. Hoofbeats. One horse, moving at a walk, coming in from the north. He stood up. He picked up the pistol. He went to the window. The rider came into the lamplight range slowly, and Caleb's first look told him it was not one of Crowe's men. The horse was trail-worn, dust-heavy, moving with the careful step of an animal that had been ridden hard for many hours and was running on fumes. The man on its back sat straight despite the fatigue that was obvious even from a distance, the posture of someone for whom sitting straight was old habit rather than current effort. He was older, gray-haired under a weathered hat, long in the body, broad through the shoulders in the way that doesn't come from being young and strong, but from being old and having been strong so long that the frame of it remained after the youth burned off. He stopped at the gate. He looked at the house with its lit windows. He looked for a long moment, and something in the way he looked, the particular quality of a man arriving at a place he's been thinking about for a long time, made Caleb's throat tighten in a way he didn't fully expect. He opened the front door. He stood on the porch. The rider looked at him from the gate. Even across the yard, even in the imperfect lamplight, Caleb could see the recognition in the man's face, and something underneath the recognition, something older and more complicated that didn't have a simple name. "Your mother wrote me a letter," Gideon Voss said. His voice was rougher than Caleb remembered, more tired, still carrying the particular weight of a man who'd spent his life meaning what he said. She said things gotten complicated. Caleb stood on the porch and looked at his father for the first time in 4 years, and the word that came to mind was not the one he would have chosen if he'd had more time to prepare. It was simply, plainly, undeniably good. "Come inside," Caleb said. "I'll put coffee on." Gideon dismounted. He tied his horse. He walked across the yard with the slight stiffness of a man who had been in the saddle for the better part of 3 days, and he came up the porch steps and stopped in front of his son, and they looked at each other in the way of two people who have too much to say and understand that none of it is going to come out right in the first 5 minutes. "You look thin," Gideon said. "You look old," Caleb said. Something shifted in the older man's face, Almost a smile, almost. Not quite. Close enough. They went inside. Pete had retreated to the far end of the kitchen with the careful tact of a man who understood he was witnessing something private. He stood up when Gideon came in, and Gideon looked at him and nodded, the brief acknowledgement of one working man to another. Caleb put the coffee on. He sat down across from his father, and Gideon sat, and the kitchen held all three of them in the lamplight with the Texas night outside the windows and whatever Silas Crowe was planning for tomorrow, still out there in the dark. "Tell me everything," Gideon said. And Caleb did. All of it, from the beginning. The draw, the brands, the canyon, Crowe on his porch, the forged complaint, Craddock, Tommy Reese, Pruitt, Fitch, the four men on the road tonight. He told it straight, without editorializing, the way he'd tell any story that needed to be understood rather than felt. He was 34 years old, and he'd been fighting this alone for almost a week, and sitting across from his father and laying the whole shape of it out on the table was not a relief exactly. More like setting down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing how heavy it was. Gideon listened without interrupting. He drank his coffee. He looked at the table while Caleb talked, not at Caleb's face, which was also how Pete listened, the kind of attention that doesn't perform itself. When Caleb finished, Gideon was quiet for a while. "This Crowe," he said finally, "he knows you didn't come to the meeting tonight. He knows. So tomorrow he moves. Whatever the next step is, he takes it tomorrow." He turned his cup in his hands, the same gesture Caleb noticed with a slight shock of recognition that Pruitt used when thinking. You've got Pruitt working the right side of this, and you've got a witness willing to talk Sunday. That's enough structure to survive, if Crowe doesn't move before then. That's the question. Gideon looked at him, direct, level, the look Caleb remembered from childhood. Not the legendary gunfighter's look, just a man's look. Clear and honest. You did the right thing, reporting it, not signing. He said it simply, not as praise but as assessment, the way you'd confirm that a fence post was set correctly. A lot of men would have signed. I know. I'm not complimenting you, I'm saying I know what it cost. A pause. Your grandfather would have signed. That man would have signed his own name to a lie before breakfast and slept fine afterward. Something crossed his face that was too complicated to name. I used to think I was better than him because I was faster with a gun. It took me a long time to figure out that wasn't the same thing as being better. Caleb had not heard his father say something like that before. He wasn't sure what to do with it, so he did what he'd learned to do with things he didn't know what to do with. He let it sit, and he didn't reach for a response that wasn't ready yet. "You should sleep," Caleb said finally. "Your horse needs rest, and so do you." "I'll sleep a few hours." Gideon stood slowly, working the trail stiffness out of his joints. He was 63 years old, and he'd ridden 3 days hard, and it showed in every movement, and yet the essential solidity of him, the thing that made a room feel slightly different when he was in it, was unchanged. "Wake me before dawn. If Crowe moves tomorrow, I want to be awake when he does." He went to the back room where Pete had made up the extra cot. The door closed. Pete looked at Caleb across the kitchen table. His expression said something that his words didn't need to. "Get some sleep," Caleb told him. Pete nodded and went out to the bunkhouse. Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table with the lamps burning and his pistol on the wood beside him, and he thought about what tomorrow was going to bring. And he thought about his father sleeping 20 feet away for the first time in 4 years. He thought about 2 things Gideon had said. The first, whatever the next step is, he takes it tomorrow. The second, older, simpler, the one that stayed. I used to think I was better than him because I was faster with a gun. Outside, the Texas night held whatever it was holding. Caleb waited for morning like a man who has done everything he can and knows that doing everything you can is not the same as doing enough, and also knows that it's all there is. Dawn came gray and cold, the kind of morning that doesn't bother announcing itself. It just arrives, flat and colorless, turning the dark into something you can see but not quite trust. Caleb was already at the kitchen table when he heard his father moving in the back room. Not the slow, disoriented sounds of a man waking up gradually. The immediate, purposeful sounds of someone who had never fully gone under. Gideon came out in his clothes from the night before, his hair uncombed, his face carrying the particular density of a man who had been thinking while he slept. He sat down. Caleb poured coffee without being asked. They drank in silence for a few minutes. Outside, the light was coming up over the eastern pasture, pale and reluctant, throwing long shadows from the fence posts that Pete had repaired. The yard was still. The road was empty. "You said Crowe had 4 men on the road last night," Gideon said, "between me and my gate." "Not threatening, demonstrating. That's how I read it." Gideon turned his cup. "A man who sends 4 men to stand in a road isn't short on bodies. He's got more somewhere, and what he was showing you last night was patience, not strength." He looked out the window. "He thinks he still controls the pace of this." "He might." "He might," Gideon agreed. "But you've got Pruitt moving, you've got a witness willing to talk Sunday, and now Crowe's missed a meeting he called himself, which tells him that whatever leverage he thought he had, it isn't enough to bring you to a dark road alone." He set his cup down. "He's going to reassess. That takes time. We've got today, maybe tonight, before he comes at this from a different angle." "What angle?" "I don't know yet. But the pattern I've seen with men like Crowe is that when persuasion stops working, they don't immediately go to force. They try embarrassment first, public pressure, something that forces you to spend energy defending yourself instead of moving forward." He paused. "You said there's a criminal complaint filed." "Formally, with the county clerk." "Then the next move is probably to push that into a formal hearing. Get it in front of a judge before your evidence has time to mature. If you're sitting in a courtroom answering questions instead of building your case, you're not getting to Tommy Reese on Sunday." Caleb hadn't thought of that specific sequence, but hearing it, he recognized it immediately. It had the logic of a man who understood how to use legal structure as a weapon, which was exactly what Crowe had demonstrated he could do. "How do I stop a formal hearing from being called?" "You don't stop it, you get ahead of it. Pruitt needs to formally open a counter-investigation today, not Sunday today, based on what you've given him. If there's an active investigation into Crowe already on record, a judge is less likely to fast-track Crowe's complaint." Gideon looked at him. "Can Pruitt do that on what he has?" "He has my statement. He has Craddock's verbal account. He has Tommy Reese's verbal account from yesterday, and the promise of a formal statement Sunday." A verbal account from a man willing to give a formal statement is enough to open an investigation. It doesn't have to be airtight. It just has to exist on paper. Caleb stood up. "I need to get to Pruitt before he opens his office and Fitch is back in place." "Fitch leaves today, you said." "Pruitt's sending him out this morning. There's a window between when Fitch leaves and when the office opens for regular business." He looked at his father. "I need to go now." Gideon nodded. He stood, and the movement was stiffer than the night before. 3 days of hard riding settling into his joints, now that the adrenaline of arrival had worn off. He picked up his hat without complaint. "I'll ride with you," he said. "You don't—" "I know I don't." He put the hat on. "I'm going anyway." They went out into the cold morning together. Pete was already in the yard, as though he'd been awake and waiting for the sound of movement in the house. He'd saddled Caleb's mare and had Gideon's trail horse ready with a fresh water and a flake of hay. He looked at Gideon with the careful respect of a man who knows a reputation and has chosen to evaluate the person separately. Gideon looked at what Pete had done with the fence, the repaired sections, the posts set squarely, the wire pulled taut. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked, and the looking itself carried something that Pete seemed to understand because he gave a short nod and stepped back. They rode into town as the morning was fully opening up, arriving at the back of the sheriff's building just as Pruitt's side door opened and Harlan Fitch came out with a packed saddlebag and the expression of a man who wasn't entirely sure why he'd been assigned a 3-day ride to the western county boundary, but had decided not to make a scene about it. He didn't see Caleb and Gideon. They stayed back in the alley, watching him mount and ride west before they moved. Pruitt answered the back door himself. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Gideon, and the recognition was immediate. Not personal familiarity, but the particular recognition that comes from a reputation specific enough to identify a man on sight. He didn't comment on it. He stepped back and let them in. "I need you to open a formal investigation today," Caleb said, before he was fully through the door. "On paper, Crowe's complaint is already in front of the county clerk, and if he can get it to a judge before our case has any official standing, he can force a hearing that buries us in procedure while his evidence rots." Pruitt looked at him steadily. "I was planning to do that Monday." "It needs to be today." The sheriff looked at Gideon. Gideon said nothing, just stood in the corner of the room with his hat in his hands, and the patience of a man who had learned at some point in the past 20 years that the loudest presence in a room is not always the most effective one. "What do I have to open it with?" Pruitt said. "My sworn statement, Craddock's account, which he'll formalize if pressed, Tommy Reese's verbal confirmation of the operation's scope and timeline, with a formal statement promised for Sunday." Caleb looked at him. "And the name Casper Holt, with a location in Delmont and a specific role in the rebranding process." Pruitt turned his coffee cup, stopped, set it down deliberately, the way a man sets down a habit when he's decided to do something instead of just think about it. "All right, sit down and give me your sworn statement right now. I'll have the investigation formally opened before noon." It took an hour. Caleb went through everything a second time, this time with Pruitt writing it out longhand and asking precise follow-up questions. Dates, times, specific language Crowe had used, the physical description of the wide man who'd hit him, the exact location of the canyon, and the count of animals he'd seen there. Gideon sat in the corner the entire time and said nothing, and his silence was not uncomfortable. It was simply present, the way a good structure is present in a building, not visible, but load-bearing. When it was done and signed, Pruitt looked at the document for a moment. Then he looked up. "I'm going to send a rider to Delmont today." Quietly. "Someone Crowe doesn't know. I want eyes on the Casper Holt operation before we move on it, because if we spook him, he burns everything and we lose the physical evidence." "How long does that take?" "If the rider leaves by noon and moves fast, I could have a report back by tomorrow evening." "And Sunday with Tommy Reese?" "I'll be there." He paused. "With a deputy I trust. Not Fitch. I've got one other man who's been with me 8 years and hasn't given me a single reason to doubt him." Caleb stood. Gideon unfolded himself from the corner chair and they moved toward the door, and Pruitt stopped them with a word. "Gideon." He said it simply, the name alone. "I'm glad you're here." Gideon looked at him. "I'm not here as a gunfighter, Sheriff. I want to be clear about that." "I know what you're here as." Pruitt held his gaze. "I'm still glad." They rode back to the ranch through a morning that had started to clear, the flat gray giving way to a harder, brighter sky. They didn't talk much. The ride had a quality of transition to it, the sense of moving from the planning phase into whatever came next, the place where plans either held or didn't. Halfway back, Gideon said, "You handled that well." The statement. Caleb glanced at him. "It's the truth. Truth isn't hard to handle. It's harder than people think." A pause. "I've watched men fall apart giving true statements because they couldn't keep the anger out of it. You kept it clean." Caleb didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to do with his father's assessments, which was a problem he'd been aware of since approximately the age of 12 and hadn't solved yet. Too much weight given to them, and he was still a boy trying to earn something. Too little, and he was wasting something genuine. "Thank you for coming," he said finally. It came out more plainly than he'd intended, which probably meant it was more accurate than a more prepared version would have been. Gideon said nothing for a moment. The road moved under them. "Your mother called in a debt I owed her," he said at last, quietly. "I would have come anyway, but I didn't know that until I was 3 days into riding." The day passed without incident, which Caleb didn't trust. He kept Pete and the 2 other hands visible and working, fencing, primarily, repairing the third gap that still needed posts, doing the ordinary daily work of a ranch in a way that looked like a place operating normally. Gideon helped without being asked, working alongside Pete on the fence line through the morning with the methodical, unhurried quality of a man doing physical work he found genuinely calming. Watching his father drive fence posts, that was not something Caleb had in his memory. It was a different picture than the one he carried, and he found himself glancing at it more than he intended to. Around midday, Ryder came up from the south. Not Crowe's men, a young man Caleb didn't recognize, riding a working horse and looking tired, who asked for Caleb by name and handed over a folded note before turning around and riding back the way he'd come. Caleb read the note. Then he read it again. It was from Del Craddock. 4 lines, written in a cramped, careful hand that suggested a man not accustomed to writing under pressure. "Crowe came here this morning. He knows about Reese, says if Reese talks to anyone official, he'll make sure Reese takes full responsibility for everything I was involved in. He wants me to convince Reese to stay quiet. I told him I'd try. I'm telling you instead. Caleb stood in the yard with the note in his hand and worked through the implications. Crowe knew about Tommy Reese. He knew Reese had spoken to Caleb, which meant either the wash house had not been as unobserved as Caleb thought, or Crowe had another source of information that he hadn't identified yet. Either way, the timeline had compressed. He went to find Gideon. His father read the note once, folded it, handed it back. He's going to approach Reese directly, Gideon said. Tonight, probably. Before Sunday. Can Pruitt move the meeting up? Pruitt's rider has already gone to Delmont. I can't reach him until tomorrow. Gideon looked at the fence line, then at the road, then at Caleb. Then we need to get to Reese first, tonight. Crowe will have someone watching. Then we go in a way that doesn't look like going. He thought for a moment. Is there a back way into town? Something off the main roads? There's a dry creek bed that runs along the eastern edge of the settlement, comes out behind Weller Street if you follow it north. How many know that route? Around here? Most people who've lived here long enough, he paused. But Crowe's men aren't from here. They're brought in. Gideon nodded slowly. It was not a perfect solution. It was a workable one, which was the only kind available. They rode out after dark, the two of them, taking the creek bed route exactly as Caleb had described it. The creek was dry this time of year, the bed smooth-packed dirt that muffled hoofbeats adequately, and they moved through the darkness carefully, Caleb leading and Gideon following with the natural, unhurried competence of a man who had moved quietly through dark country more times than he'd ever catalogued. The back of Weller Street came up on their right as the creek bent north. They tied the horses in the shadow of a storage building and went the rest of the way on foot, staying off the main street, cutting through the narrow gap between the wash house and the cooperage next to it. Tommy Reese answered the knock at the wash house's rear door with a lamp in one hand and the wary expression of a man who had been expecting either this or something worse. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Gideon. He didn't ask who Gideon was. The shape of the man apparently communicated enough. They went inside, into the warm, soap-smelling dark of the wash house, with its rows of basins and its drying lines, and Tommy set the lamp on a work table and crossed his arms. Crowe came to see me today, he said, at the feed supplier, in front of everyone. What did he say? He was polite about it, very polite. He said he'd heard some rumors about people asking questions, and that he hoped I understood that loyalty was something he valued highly, and that people who demonstrated loyalty to him were protected, while people who failed to demonstrate it had a habit of finding their situations complicated. Tommy's voice was carefully even. He put his hand on my shoulder when he said it, just rested it there, and then he smiled and walked out. He was telling you he already knows. Yes. Tommy looked at Caleb. He knows I talked to you. I don't know how, but he knows. We're moving the meeting up, Caleb said. Not Sunday, tomorrow night. Pruitt will come directly to you, wherever you feel safest. Tomorrow night doesn't feel safer than Sunday. It's safer than Sunday because Sunday he'll have had another 36 hours to work out what to do about you. He held the young man's gaze. Craddock reached out to me today. Crowe is asking Craddock to pressure you into staying quiet. That's what he's doing instead of coming at you directly. He's using your connections to apply force, which means he's not sure enough of his position to move on you openly. Or he's saving that for after the soft approach fails, Tommy said. He wasn't wrong. Gideon, who had stood by the door since they came in, spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, unhurried, the voice of a man who didn't use it unless he meant to. Let me ask you something. What were you planning to do if none of this had happened? If Caleb hadn't seen the canyon, hadn't reported it, hadn't come to you, what were you going to do? Tommy looked at him. A long pause. I was going to keep working at the feed supplier and try to forget about the rest. And how was that going? The young man looked at the lamp. Something shifted in his face. Not the careful, managed expression he'd been maintaining, but something underneath it, the unmediated version. Not well. No. Gideon's voice wasn't unkind, just direct. It doesn't go well, carrying something like that. It has a weight that doesn't distribute over time. It just compresses. He paused. I know because I carried things like that for the better part of 20 years. And the only thing I can tell you from the other side of it is that putting it down is harder than you think it's going to be, but the weight goes away, actually goes away. Tommy looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Caleb. Tomorrow night, where? Wherever you choose. He thought about it. There's a stock barn on the east edge of town. It's used for animal auctions, empty on weekdays. I've got a key. I've worked an auction or two there." He paused. "I can be there by 8. We'll get word to Pruitt. And if Crowe's watching, let us worry about Crowe's watching," Gideon said. "Not a boast, just a statement of distribution of responsibility, clean and simple." They slipped back out the way they'd come in, through the gap between buildings, along the creek bed, back to their horses. The ride home was quiet and cold, and somewhere around the midpoint Caleb said, without planning to, "What you said to him, about carrying things." Gideon rode for a moment without answering. "It was true." "I know it was." Caleb looked at the dark road. "I didn't know you thought about it that way." "There's a lot about what I think that I've never been good at saying." He paused. "That's something I should have fixed a long time ago." They reached the ranch and put the horses up, and the night moved into its later hours, and Caleb lay in his bed and found sleep came faster than it had any right to. The morning brought 2 things. The first was Pruitt's rider back from Delmont, arriving before breakfast with a report that landed in Caleb's chest like a stone dropped from height. Casper Holt's operation in Delmont was real, active, and large. The rider, a compact, quiet man named Asa, who Pruitt had been using for sensitive work for years, had spent the night observing and had counted 11 men working the property, with a current holding of no fewer than 200 head, multiple branding irons of various registered designs, and the kind of equipment that required infrastructure, squeeze chutes, branding fires, record boxes. It was not a man working out of a barn. It was a facility. More importantly, 3 of the animals in the current holding were carrying visible double-brand work that Asa's experienced eye had spotted from the fence line. Fresh double bar over older marks, same as what Caleb had seen in the canyon. If a livestock inspector got into that property today, the physical evidence was there. The second thing was Silas Crowe, arriving at Caleb's gate at 10 in the morning with only 2 men this time, which was either a sign of confidence or a different kind of calculation entirely. He didn't come to the porch. He stopped at the gate and called out, and Caleb went to him, and they stood on either side of the gate's post like 2 men having a conversation over a fence, which was technically what they were doing. Crowe looked different from the first time. Not less composed. He was always composed. It was his defining characteristic. But there was something working underneath the composure that hadn't been visible before. A tightness around the eyes. The quality of a man who is managing more variables than he'd planned for. "Your father's here," Crowe said. It wasn't a question. "He is. I heard Gideon Voss hadn't left the territories in 4 years." He hadn't. Crowe looked at the house for a moment. He seemed to be weighing something. "This doesn't need to get to the point where men get hurt," he said. "It got to that point when you hit me on my own porch," Caleb said. "And before that, when you started stealing from ranchers who couldn't afford to lose what you took." Crowe's jaw tightened slightly. It was the first involuntary movement Caleb had seen from him. "I'm going to make you an offer. It's a real offer, not a threat dressed up as one. You drop your cooperation with Pruitt. Whatever you've given him, you tell him you were mistaken. The brands you saw were ambiguous. Your account was less certain than you initially represented. The complaint against you gets withdrawn. Your records get returned. The cattle that were moved from your property, I'll compensate you fairly for them. You go back to running your ranch, and this is finished." Caleb looked at him. He thought about Hector Murrieta. He thought about 8 ranches over 18 months. He thought about the hundreds of animals that had passed through 4 holding areas, through Casper Holt's branding fires, into buyers' hands across however many counties. He thought about the families those animals represented. "No," he said. Crowe looked at him for a long moment, and what passed across his face was not anger. It was the specific expression of a man who has fully understood that the next phase of something is unavoidable and is making his peace with that. "All right," he said. He turned his horse. The 2 men with him turned theirs. Before he rode off, he looked back once. "Bring your father if you want. It doesn't change the arithmetic." He rode south. Caleb stood at the gate and watched him go and felt, with a clarity that was almost cold, that the offer had been Crowe's last attempt at resolution before he moved into territory from which there was no retreat. The arithmetic Crowe mentioned was not nothing. 6 men, possibly more, against Caleb, Gideon, Pete, and 2 ranch hands who were good workers but not fighting men. He went back inside. Gideon was at the kitchen table. He'd heard enough from the window. "He's going to move tonight," Gideon said. That's what I think. Not the road this time, the property itself. Yes. Pete appeared in the doorway. He'd been in earshot of the yard. His expression was past the point of reassessment. He'd processed what this was going to look like and had arrived at the other side of it. I can get word to 2 men in town, Pete said. Ranchers, I know. Men who've been losing cattle themselves and don't know why. If I tell them what this is actually about, you'd be bringing them into something that isn't their fight, Caleb said. Their cattle have been stolen for 18 months, Pete said evenly. It is their fight. They just didn't know it. Caleb looked at Gideon. Gideon gave nothing with his expression. He was letting Caleb make this decision, which was its own kind of statement. Go, Caleb said. Be back before dark. Pete went. Gideon stood and moved to the window, looking at the yard, the road, the angles of approach. There are 3 ways in, Caleb said, coming to stand beside him. Main road from the south, the creek track from the east, and the ridge behind the north pasture. You'd have to come down on foot, but it's possible. He'll come from the south because it's fastest, and he has enough men that speed matters more than subtlety. Gideon studied the yard layout without hurrying. If he's got 6 or more, he'll split them. Some at the gate, some around the east side to cut off retreat. Maybe 1 or 2 up the road to block. So we can't hold the house. You can't hold any fixed point against superior numbers. You don't try to hold anything. He turned from the window. You take the initiative away from him, which means you're not inside when he arrives. Caleb looked at him. Where are we? Where he doesn't expect you to be. A pause. Show me the creek track. They spent the next 2 hours walking the property in the pale afternoon light, Gideon asking questions and Caleb answering them, the older man moving slowly but with a careful attention to terrain that had nothing to do with the legend and everything to do with the practical intelligence of someone who had spent decades understanding how physical space shapes the outcome of confrontations. He wasn't building a battle plan. He was reading a landscape the way you read a document, looking for what it actually said rather than what you expected it to say. At one point, Gideon crouched at the edge of the creek bed and looked back toward the house. The angle was not what Caleb expected. You could see the gate and the main road approach without being visible from either. He could see his father filing it. If Pete's men come, Gideon said, still looking at the angle, keep them off the direct approach. Put them on the creek side and the ridge, not because they're fighters, because bodies in unexpected positions create uncertainty, and uncertainty slows a man down. You've done this before, Caleb said. Not accusatory, just acknowledgement. More times than I'm comfortable with. Gideon stood, his knees objecting audibly. It never gets to be something you're good at in a way that feels good. They went back to the house. Caleb wrote a note to Pruitt, short, specific, no wasted language, and sent his youngest hand into town with it and instructions to go directly to the sheriff's private residence, not the office. The afternoon thinned. Pete returned at 4 with 2 men Caleb knew by sight, Reeves Holton and a quiet older rancher named Carl Dumas, who'd lost 40 head over the past year and had the expression of a man who had finally been given a name for a thing he'd been suffering through without one. They didn't need a long explanation. Pete had given them the shape of it on the ride out, and the shape was clear enough. They ate together, all 6 of them at Caleb's kitchen table, which was not large enough for 6 people, and nobody mentioned it. The meal was simple, the conversation was sparse, and the particular quality of what was unspoken held the room in a way that Caleb understood was not dread. It was something more functional than dread. It was preparation, which is what dread becomes when people decide to do something with it. After, Gideon took each man separately and spent 5 minutes with them. Not giving orders exactly, more like asking questions that clarified where each man was most useful and what he was and wasn't willing to do. He didn't push anyone past their comfort. He just mapped the actual resources available, which was a different and more honest exercise than assuming. The sun went down. They moved to their positions as the dark came on. Pete and Holton on the creek track, Dumas behind the outbuilding to the east, Caleb and Gideon at the edge of the tree line north of the house, where the approach from the south was fully visible, but the tree line itself was shadow. They waited. Gideon stood beside Caleb in the dark and said nothing. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had the specific ease of 2 people who have run out of things to say that aren't better served by saying nothing. Caleb was aware of his father's breathing beside him, slow and regular, The breathing of a man who had been in tense, dark, waiting situations enough times that his body had stopped treating them as exceptional. He heard them before he saw them. The sound of multiple horses on the main road coming from the south, not trying particularly hard to be quiet, which told him Gideon had been right about the calculation. Crowe wasn't coming for subtlety. He was coming with enough force that subtlety wasn't necessary. 7 riders came through the gate, 7, not 6. Caleb counted them in the darkness as they moved into the yard. Silas Crowe was in the lead. The wide man was to his right. The others spread out as they came into the yard. 2 toward the east side, 1 staying at the gate, 3 moving toward the house. The house was dark and quiet, which stopped them. A man moving toward a house he expects to find occupied and finds dark pulls up, recalculates. The 3 who'd moved toward the porch slowed, looked at each other. Crowe called out, "Voss?" Silence. "I know you're here." He looked around the yard. His voice was controlled, but something in it was different from the voice he'd used at the gate that morning, less certain of its own authority. He had 7 men and a dark, quiet house, and a yard that felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully identify. "I'm here," Caleb said. His voice came from the tree line. All 7 men turned toward it. The repositioning was instinctive and exactly what Gideon had said it would be. Surprise and uncertainty causing them to turn their attention toward the known point and away from everything else. The man nearest the gate moved his hand toward his rifle. What happened next was fast in the way that things are fast when they've been thought through carefully in advance. Gideon's shot came from 6 feet to Caleb's left. A single crack, precise, the rifle bullet taking the man's hat off and sending it spinning into the dark. Not the man. The hat. The man's hand went still. "Next one doesn't miss the hat," Gideon said. His voice carried completely across the yard. Quiet, unhurried, and with the specific quality of a man who has absolutely no doubt about what he just said. The yard froze. It was not a dramatic freeze. It was the practical, functional freeze of 7 men recalculating their situation simultaneously. They had ridden in expecting to find a rancher and a handful of hands. They had found a dark house, a voice from a tree line, and a rifle shot that had been precise enough and restrained enough to communicate something more frightening than aggression, competence. The man at the gate was very still, his hat somewhere in the road behind him. Crowe looked at the tree line. He couldn't see Gideon. The darkness and the angle made that impossible. But he knew. Caleb could see it in the set of his shoulders. He knew. "Voss?" Crowe's voice was carefully level. "Whatever you think?" 3 men on the creek side, Pete's voice said from the east. "Put the rifles down." Crowe turned. 2 of his men shifted in their saddles. "The outbuilding." Duma's voice came from behind 2 of Crowe's riders, closer than anyone expected. Both men went rigid. The arithmetic had changed. Crowe sat on his horse in the middle of the yard and looked at the dark around him, and Caleb could see the man working through it. How many, where, what they had. He was smart enough to understand that the answer to all 3 questions was unfavorable and was not going to improve with time. Caleb stepped out of the tree line. He walked across the yard to the edge of lamplighting distance and stopped. He looked at Crowe. "Get down," he said. "All of you. Leave the rifles on the horses." Crowe looked at him. Something was working in the man's face. Not surrender, not yet. Something prior to surrender. The recognition that a position he'd controlled completely 12 hours ago had been taken from him by an arrangement he hadn't seen coming and couldn't reverse quickly enough to matter. The wide man looked at Crowe. Crowe, after a moment, nodded. They dismounted. One at a time, slowly, hands visible. The wide man last, with the particular stiffness of a man setting down something heavy that he's not accustomed to setting down. Caleb turned at the sound of hoofbeats on the road and saw, in the faint starlight, 3 more riders coming through the gate. For a half-second his stomach dropped. Then he recognized Pruitt's shape in the lead, his bad knee visible even in silhouette in the way he held that leg clear of the saddle fender. The deputy came through behind him, and behind the deputy, a man Caleb didn't recognize with a badge that caught the light. Pruitt pulled up. He looked at the 7 men standing in the yard. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the tree line where Gideon still hadn't moved. He reached into his coat and produced a document that even from a distance carried the specific authority of something officially prepared. "Silas Crowe," he said. I have a warrant for your arrest and for the arrest of any persons found in your company tonight, on charges including organized cattle theft, fraudulent filing of criminal complaints, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. He looked around the yard. I also have, in my deputy's bag, a sworn statement from one Thomas Reese taken 2 hours ago that establishes the scope and duration of your operation in sufficient detail for the circuit judge to call a full hearing. A pause. The hearing where you were planning to use your complaint against Caleb Voss has been suspended pending review of the counter-investigation. He looked at Crowe directly. It's done. Crowe stood in Caleb's yard in the starlight, and for the first time since this had started, Caleb saw something in the man's face that was not composure, not calculation, not the controlled management of a man who believed he controlled the situation. He saw the specific expression of a person who has run a very large, very organized thing for a very long time and has just understood that it has ended. It was not a dramatic expression. It was almost ordinary, just a man's face, doing the quiet arithmetic of what happens next. Get on your knees, Pruitt said. He didn't raise his voice. All of you. They did. Gideon walked out of the tree line then, unhurried, the rifle across his arm, and came to stand beside his son. He was 63 years old and trail-sore, and he'd been standing in the dark for 2 hours, and he looked at the 7 men kneeling in the dirt of Caleb's yard with the expression of a man who has seen this before and does not find it satisfying in the way that stories suggest it should be. It was just the end of something that needed to end. He and Caleb stood side by side and watched Pruitt and his men work through the formal business of arrest, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Gideon said very quietly, "You didn't need me here." Caleb looked at him. "No," he agreed. "I would have managed." "But?" Caleb thought about the past week. The forged document. Craddock's empty floor. Tommy Reese's frightened face in a wash house before dawn. The long nights with a pistol on the kitchen table. "But it was better that you were." Gideon nodded once. Just once. The deputies were putting men in irons now, the metallic sounds carrying across the yard in the cold night air. Crowe was being led toward Pruitt's horse, and he passed within 10 feet of where Caleb stood, and for a moment their eyes met, and Crowe looked at him with an expression that was not quite anything Caleb had a name for. Not rage, not defeat exactly, more like the look of a man revising an assessment he'd made of something, recognizing that he'd underestimated a variable in his calculation, and that the variable had been Caleb Voss all along. He was led past. He didn't say anything. Caleb turned away and looked at his property. The dark pastures, the cut fence sections that still needed finishing, the outbuilding standing open, the house with its lit windows coming back to life as Pete moved inside and started a lamp. He thought about what it looked like to a man who had built it and nearly lost it and stood in it now on the other side of the thing that had threatened it. It looked like his. Imperfectly, honestly, expensively his. "Come inside," he said to his father. They went in out of the cold, and the door closed behind them, and the night continued around the house with the ordinary sounds of a Texas ranch settling into late evening. Nothing dramatic, nothing resolved into simplicity, just the functional continuance of a life that had survived what had been set against it. The morning after Crowe's arrest had the particular quality of a held breath finally released. Not peaceful exactly, but emptied of something that had been pressing down on everything for days. Caleb slept until the sun was fully up, which he hadn't done in a week. When he came out to the kitchen, Gideon was already there, not drinking coffee this time, but standing at the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the yard in the specific way of a man taking inventory of a place he's been and is beginning to think about leaving. Caleb put the coffee on. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes, and it was not the uncomfortable silence of two people with too much unresolved between them. It was something quieter than that. The silence of people who had been through something together and were still finding the shape of what it had changed. "Pruitt came by early," Gideon said, "before you were up. He said the circuit judge is sending a marshal's team to Delmont today, Casper Holt's operation." He turned from the window. "They found documents in Crowe's saddlebags last night. Records of transactions going back 2.5 years. Names of buyers, sellers, holding locations across 4 counties. Caleb looked at him. "He carried records with him?" "Apparently he rode out last night planning to finish this and then move the whole operation east before morning. The records were packed to go." Something passed across Gideon's face, not quite dark humor, but adjacent. He didn't plan on needing to use them as evidence against himself. Caleb poured 2 cups and set one on the table for his father. He sat down. He thought about Silas Crowe packing records to ride out with, already planning the next version of the operation in a different county, and the thought that came to him was not satisfaction exactly, more like the recognition that a man like Crowe never really believed it would end. He'd been doing this too long without consequence. That kind of sustained impunity changes how a person thinks about risk. Tommy Reese, Caleb said. Pruitt's handling it. The boy's statement was formal and sworn, and Pruitt told me he's recommending to the circuit judge that Reese's cooperation be considered in whatever proceedings come. Gideon sat down across from him. He's not going to walk away clean, but he's not going to be buried with the rest of it either. That's fair. It is. A pause. Fairer than he expected, I think. Caleb drank his coffee. Outside, Pete was moving across the yard with a purposeful stride that suggested a man who had organized his morning and was working through it, which was Pete's natural state and one of the things Caleb had always valued about him. Normal. Ordinary. The ranch resuming its rhythm. The ranchers who lost cattle, Caleb said. Hector Murrieta and the others. Pruitt says the records in Crowe's saddlebags should be enough to establish what was taken from whom, whether they can recover the actual animals. Gideon shook his head slightly. Some will be untraceable by now, sold on, moved through too many hands. But the documentation of the losses exists, and there are legal mechanisms for compensation when a criminal enterprise is dismantled. He paused. It's not everything. Some of those men lost time they can't get back, land they might have sold under pressure, hands they let go. I know. But it's more than they had yesterday, which is something. It was something. Caleb knew it was. He also knew that something and enough were not the same word, and that the gap between them was where the real cost of what Crowe had run for 3 years actually lived, in Hector Murrieta's dismissed hand, in whoever had packed up and left a spread because the numbers wouldn't work anymore. Those losses didn't get restored by a marshal's team riding into Delmont. What you could do was make sure it didn't continue. That was the actual achievable thing. Craddock, Caleb said. Gideon's expression was measured. That one's complicated. He came through at the end. He did, after some calculation. He turned his cup. I'm not criticizing him for the calculation. Most people calculate. But he's going to have to answer for the transactions, and calculating correctly at the last moment doesn't erase the months before. No, but it should count for something. Probably will. That's Pruitt's territory now. And the judges. Gideon looked at him directly. You did what you could for him. You gave him the chance to come right. That's what you could control. Caleb nodded. He sat with that for a moment, testing whether it was true, deciding that it was. Not comfortably true. Not resolved feeling true. Just accurate. You could offer a man a door. Whether he walked through it, at what pace, with what intention, that was his. 3 days later, the marshal's team returned from Delmont with Casper Holt in custody and 6 of his 11 workers, along with 4 boxes of records, a full inventory of rebranded animals still present on the property, and the branding equipment itself. The irons, the heating setup, the squeeze chutes where the work had been done. The circuit judge called a formal hearing for the following month. Hector Murrieta came to Caleb's ranch on the 4th day. He was a small, compact man in his 60s, brown from decades of outdoor work, with hands that looked like they'd been doing hard labor since he was 12, and probably had. He came alone, and he took his hat off when Caleb answered the door, and he said without preamble, "Pruitt told me it was you who started this." "I found something," Caleb said. "I reported it." "Don't do that." Murrieta looked at him steadily. "Don't make it small. I've been losing animals for 18 months, and I couldn't understand it, and I thought I was losing my mind, thought I was getting old and careless." He stopped. "My foreman, good man, 30 years, I let him go in August because I couldn't make payroll. I told myself it was the fencing, the drought, bad luck." His voice was careful and controlled in the way of someone managing something that would run if he gave it room. "It wasn't." Caleb held the door open. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Caleb had sat with Pruitt, with his father, with Pete through long nights. Caleb put coffee on. Murrieta sat with his hat in his hands and looked at the grain of the wood. "I can't get those 18 months back," Murrieta said. No. My foreman, Roberto. He found work in the next county, I think. Might be able to reach him. He turned the hat. Might be too late for it to matter. It might not be. The older man looked up. Something in his face was not quite hope, and not quite the absence of it. The tentative, careful middle ground of a person who has been disappointed enough times to be cautious about expectation. You really just saw something and reported it. Yes. Most men wouldn't. Caleb thought about that. About the moment on the ridge, looking down at 40 head of cattle in a draw that wasn't his, knowing what the brands meant and knowing equally clearly what reporting it would cost. I almost didn't, he said. I sat on my horse for a long time. Marietta looked at him. But you did. Yes. Why? It was a real question, asked with genuine curiosity by a man who wanted an actual answer, not a modest deflection. Caleb sat with it for a moment. Because I knew, he said, and knowing and doing nothing is its own kind of choice. It's not neutral. You're not staying out of it by staying quiet. You're choosing which side of it you're on. He paused. I didn't want to be on that side. Marietta was quiet. Then he nodded, once, and the nod had the weight of a man settling something internally that had been unsettled. They drank their coffee. They talked about cattle, actual cattle, breeds and prices, and the specific problems of running a herd through a dry Texas autumn. And by the time Marietta left, an hour later, something had shifted in the air between them that had nothing to do with criminal proceedings or formal hearings. Just two ranchers talking about the work they both knew. Gideon stayed 10 days. He stayed longer than Caleb had expected, and not in the way of a man who didn't know when to leave. In the way of a man who had decided that what this situation needed was his presence for a specific duration and was being honest about what that duration was. He was not underfoot. He worked. He helped Pete finish the fence repairs, replaced 2 rotted boards in the barn, spent an afternoon going over Caleb's cattle records with him and offering observations about the herd's condition and what the winter might require that were specific and practical and rooted in decades of genuine knowledge. In the evenings, they sat together, sometimes talking, sometimes not. Gideon told stories about places Caleb didn't know, people who were gone, things that had happened in the years when they were not in each other's lives. He told them the way he did most things, without embellishment, without apparent desire for a particular reaction, just the facts of his experience laid out and allowed to mean what they meant. Caleb listened. He asked questions. Some of them were the questions of a son trying to understand a father. Some of them were the questions of a man genuinely interested in another man's experience. Both kinds were honest. Both kinds got honest answers. On the 8th day, Gideon said something that stayed. They were on the porch in the late afternoon, the light going long and amber the way it did in November, and Gideon was looking at the pastures where Caleb's remaining cattle were moving in the slow, purposeful way of animals that have enough room and enough grass. Some of Caleb's recovered herd had been returned already, animals identified by Pruitt's investigation and traced back to his property. Not all of them, but enough that the pastures weren't empty anymore. I made a mistake, Gideon said, when you were young. I thought leaving the violent life meant leaving the things I knew, like they were the same thing. He didn't look at Caleb. He watched the cattle. So I didn't teach you anything I knew, because I didn't want you to become what I'd been. Caleb waited. But knowing how to handle yourself in a bad situation isn't the same as being a violent man. I confused the skill with the character. He paused. You figured out the character on your own. You would have been fine with a few more of the skills. Caleb looked out at the pastures alongside him. I managed. You did. Because you're stubborn, which you got from your mother, and because you think clearly under pressure, which I'm going to take some credit for even if you don't want me to. A brief pause that might have been the closest Gideon Voss came to a smile in practical terms. But you shouldn't have had to figure it all out yourself. No, Caleb agreed. I shouldn't have. It sat between them. Not as an accusation, not as an apology that expected absolution, just as a true thing acknowledged by both of them. That was, Caleb had come to understand over the past 10 days how his father dealt with the things he'd gotten wrong, not with elaborate regret or self-flagellation, with acknowledgement. You name it, you sit with it, you let it be what it is. He wasn't sure if he'd learned that from Gideon or arrived at it himself, and wasn't sure the distinction mattered. On the 10th day, Gideon packed his saddlebags. He did it in the morning, methodically, the same way he did everything. Caleb watched from the porch without offering to help, because it wasn't the kind of task that needed help, and his father would have found it awkward. Pete shook Gideon's hand in the yard. Gideon said something to him that Caleb couldn't hear from the porch, and Pete laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, and nodded. Gideon turned toward the porch. They looked at each other for a moment, his father standing in the yard with his horse behind him and the November sky above, and the whole recovered, ordinary, imperfect landscape of Caleb's ranch around them both. "Write to your mother," Gideon said. "I will. Not the careful kind, the real kind. I know the difference now." Gideon looked at him, something in his face, not sentimental, never sentimental, but something that was in the same territory as sentiment without being the thing itself. "I know you do," he said. He mounted. He rode north. He didn't look back, which was not coldness. Caleb understood it wasn't coldness. It was just how the man moved through the world. Forward, with intention. The looking had already been done. Caleb stood on the porch until the figure on horseback diminished against the horizon and was gone, and the road was just a road again, and the morning was just a morning. The circuit court hearing was held 6 weeks later. Silas Crowe was present, seated, with the specific stillness of a man who has spent the interval between arrest and hearing making peace with an outcome he cannot change. The documentation from his own saddlebags, the records he'd packed to take with him when he fled, became the primary evidence against him. There is a particular justice in a man being undone by his own careful record-keeping, and the court acknowledged it without ceremony. Casper Holt entered a full statement in exchange for a reduced sentence, which extended the evidentiary record significantly and confirmed the scope that Tommy Reese had described. 4 counties, 3 years, somewhere north of 1800, head across 11 ranches. Harlan Fitch was charged separately with obstruction and conspiracy, and his quiet, methodical betrayal of the office he'd sat in for 2 years was entered into the record without drama, but with completeness. Tommy Reese testified. He stood in the courtroom and he told the truth without embellishment or self-protection, and the truth was damaging enough to his own history that telling it was not an easy thing. But he told it. Caleb watched him from the gallery and thought about the wash house, the early morning, the young man deciding whether to cross the street, and understood that some people arrive at the right choice by a crooked route, and the route doesn't cancel the arrival. Silas Crowe was sentenced to 12 years. The men who had ridden with him received varying terms. Casper Holt received 7 years with his cooperation noted. Harlan Fitch received 4. Del Craddock was fined, placed on formal probation, and required to cooperate fully with the livestock recovery effort. He showed up to every meeting Pruitt called. He was not, Caleb thought, a reformed man in the way of stories. He was a frightened man who had made the calculation that going right was now more in his interest than going wrong. Whether that calculation would hold over time was not something Caleb could know. He hoped it would. He didn't count on it. Hector Murrieta rehired Roberto in December. He stopped by the ranch to tell Caleb about it, not because he needed to, but because he seemed to have decided that Caleb was someone he wanted to keep talking to. They'd had 3 conversations since the first one, each longer than the last. Roberto had come back for less pay than he'd had before, which Murrieta said he'd make right as the season improved, and Roberto had said he knew. Caleb's records were returned, shut. Most of them, the box that had been taken from his outbuilding, minus 2 folders that Crowe's people had apparently lost or destroyed. Pruitt helped him reconstruct the missing documentation from county records and cattle registry filings. And the process took 3 weeks and was tedious and necessary and exactly the kind of unglamorous detail that no one ever put in a story about frontier justice. The cattle that had been taken from Caleb's property, 109 head, were partially recovered. 64 animals were returned, identified through Casper Holt's branding records, and traced back through the buyer's chain. The remaining 45 were gone too far into the system to retrieve. Caleb filed a formal claim for compensation, which would take time and would not fully cover the loss, and he knew that going in. He rebuilt. Not dramatically, not in a way that looked like triumph from the outside. He repaired the fence, restocked carefully with animals he could afford, renegotiated a supply arrangement that gave him better terms on winter feed. He paid Pete a raise that was smaller than Pete deserved and larger than Caleb could strictly afford, and Pete said it was fine, and they both knew it wasn't quite fine, but was the closest to fine that was currently available. He wrote his mother a real letter, not the careful kind. The ones that told her what had happened, what it had cost, what it had clarified, and what it had felt like to have his father ride north on the 10th morning and disappear against the horizon. He told her that he understood some things now that he hadn't before, and that some of those things were about Gideon, and some of them were about himself, and some of them were about how much easier it is to be alone than to let people in, and how that ease is not the same thing as strength, no matter how much it feels like it. She wrote back quickly. Her letter was 2 pages, which was long for her. She said she was glad. She said she'd been afraid he was going to spend his whole life being careful, and that careful was a good thing, but it wasn't a complete thing. She said she was going to come visit in the spring. He wrote back and said that would be good. There is something that the frontier teaches you, if you live on it long enough and pay attention to what it's actually saying rather than what the stories about it say. It teaches you that courage is not the absence of fear, and it is not the presence of certainty. It is something much more ordinary and much harder to sustain. It is the willingness to act on what you know is right when acting costs something real. Caleb Voss was not a hero. I was a rancher who noticed something, followed it when he could have turned away, told the truth when lying would have been simpler, and held his ground when holding it was expensive. He did all of those things imperfectly, with doubt and fear, and moments where he genuinely wasn't sure the choice he'd made was going to be survivable. He made mistakes. He needed help he was reluctant to ask for. He carried the weight of it alone longer than he should have, because he'd spent 15 years confusing self-sufficiency with integrity. What he learned, what the whole long, costly week of it taught him, was that the life he'd built was worth protecting, not because it was his, but because of what it connected him to. The work, the land, the people around him, whose losses were real even when they weren't his. Hector Murrieta's cattle were not Caleb's cattle, but Caleb was the man who could see them, and seeing them and doing nothing was not neutrality. It was a choice with consequences that spread out from it like water. He also learned something about his father that he hadn't been able to learn from a distance. Gideon Voss was not the legend, and he was not the careful, deliberately quiet man who had spent 20 years trying to become someone easier to love. I was both of those things and also something simpler and harder to name, a man who had made genuine mistakes and was trying in the time he had left to account for them honestly without demanding that the accounting buy him forgiveness. That was not a small thing. Caleb had watched men who couldn't do it. The difference was significant. The ranch recovered. Not fully, not quickly, not without the particular grinding effort of rebuilding something that has been taken apart by someone who knew what they were doing. But it recovered. The pastures filled again. The fence held. The work continued in the unglamorous day-by-day manner of all the work that actually matters. Some evenings, Caleb sat on the porch in the particular quiet of a Texas night and thought about the moment on the ridge, the gray mare, the draw, the 40 head of cattle that weren't his, the knowledge settling into him like something irreversible. He thought about the 30 seconds he'd sat there before he started writing down. He thought, that was the moment. Not the confrontation, not the testimony, not the night in the yard with Crowe's men kneeling in the dirt. The moment was the 30 seconds on the ridge when he decided to ride down and look instead of turning away. Everything after that was consequence. Everything before it was the life that had built a man capable of making that choice. He didn't know if he'd always be capable of it. He didn't know if the next time, and there would be a next time, some version of it, because the frontier was not a place that ran out of moments that cost something. He'd have the same steadiness. He hoped so. He worked at being someone who would. That is, when you strip everything else away, what it comes down to. Not a single act of courage, but the daily effort to be someone who is capable of it when the moment arrives. The moment doesn't announce itself. It just comes, ordinary as a Tuesday in October, and it finds you wherever you are, and it asks what you're made of. Caleb Voss found out what he was made of in a draw full of stolen cattle on a cold autumn afternoon, and the answer wasn't everything he'd hoped, and it was more than he'd feared, and it was, in the end, enough.